Okay. All right. Hello, everyone, and everyone tuned in online. We're going to get started on the 2024, which is the fiscal year 2025, right? Or this is a review, year in review.
It's an in-year review about kind of a precursor to the 25 budget plan.
Okay.
Okay.
So a review and a precursor of what's coming. So
All right.
take it away first.
All right, let me get my hand set up here. All right. Well, good evening, officially residents. I think we had resident last year, so that's already, I guess, a 300% increase here, which is good to see. And of course, I saw people kind of slowly hopping in online as well. So just for those unfamiliar, we did this as a precursor to last year's fiscal year 24 budget planning process that was kind of seen as a fiscal year in year 23 state of the township update. So think of it like a summary of the macro factors that affect your community when you're talking about just issues ongoing in your township, kind of what are some of those constraints, just to get kind of a generic kind of public understanding level of these are what we are constrained by doing, and this is what we're working on to help improve things as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and just get right into it. So one way that we wanted to do it this year was to not have it, and my cursor's already not working, that's a good point. Kind of a format, if you will. So this year, I wanted to structure the format that kind of aligned, if you members of the board remember earlier on in the summer, we did an exercise about having board members identify their like most in the moment types of priorities and then rank and file them accordingly. And in this case, we would combine comp plan priorities versus those updated priorities to kind of show a sense of like ordering of tiers and kind of where we are ranking them. Not by saying that it's not a priority more, but just kind of against each other, just more of a rack and stacking. And then within that, go through each individual one of those areas as a focus point to kind of talk more about that issue. So we'll go into all the strategic priorities. These shouldn't be new. These were talked about in a public session. I believe it was in May or June. These were the ones that the board kind of voted and ranked on. Then we'll talk about, to kind of wrap everything up, just a summary understanding of where we're at and final recommendations. So without further ado, the comp plan versus strategic priorities. If you are familiar with the document, 2018 Comprehensive Plan, it was a community planning document that kind of provides that, we'll call it guidance for public funding for initiatives, priorities, and projects in the township. Also provides staff kind of like a understanding of what we should be working on unless directed otherwise, and kind of a nice framing of the issues as the community identified. And with that, these were the ones that I think the inputs for this occurred during 2016, 2017 time frame. The document was put together as of 2018. And these were kind of the categorical areas that were highlighted within that based off of ongoing stakeholder community inputs, from the committee, and also general resident inputs from the online surveys. And of course, this is all in the document itself. But you can see here, there's a lot of overlap between those macro level large ones and kind of all the things that were identified along the way for residents. And with that, I guess the general understanding is if you had to take what you know now and teleport yourself back about 8 years ago, how would you respond to these same types of issues? Would you identify things in different manners? So it's kind of a good thought exercise. And then with that, even if you do have a clearly kind of delineated sense of your priorities, it doesn't mean that you have to execute them in kind of top to bottom. It's just things and conditions change over time. So you should always be reassessing your ability to complete these types of functions on an annual basis, which is kind of why a State of the Township update exists in the first place. So part of this, I already alluded to the exercise to rank them, and this is what the board identified. These are ones that were, I think, kind of broken out into where you can see the highest weighted areas were, and then kind of the middle weighted areas, and then the lower weighted areas. And like I said, this doesn't mean that we're not doing things down here. It's just that the primary focus should kind of live up here when it comes to staff attention and agenda items moving forward in the business agenda. So the good way to kind of organize this is into kind of priorities is to put them in buckets of tiers, because we're not just going to focus on one thing at a time. So this is how they kind of break out into tiers with some, I'm not going to go through line by line here, but just some examples of those categories in of themselves as they roll up to it. Tier 2, Tier 3, and then Tier 4. But with that, there is some overlap. So it's not like what we updated in 25 is completely independent of the comp plan. So these are those categories as they relate to those updated priorities, if that makes sense. And so you're saying everything in the comp plan that rolls up to kind of the number 2 priority of economic development, you're focusing on these areas within your comprehensive plan. So that's kind of our reference guide. And of course, we update that with just new information as it comes to light for staff as we're performing due diligence on these topics. So these are your tier 1s. Addressing rising costs of public safety services kind of doesn't have really a comp plan component of it, which is kind of probably a missing piece of the comprehensive plan, not focusing on, I'll call them like departmental community services. So that's where I said, if I look back at the comprehensive plan, it's a helpful tool, but it doesn't define everything. So that's one where I would say that's a big missing piece, considering the gravity of providing funding for public safety is our number 1 expenditure as a township. And then as you go into the remaining tiers here, you can see some of the kind of roll-ups, and then so on and so forth. It is interesting here that you have New Garden Flying Field, but part of the component of New Garden Flying Field's existence was having the associated airport development zone, which pertains to economic development, which is actually one of the number 2 priorities. So even though it kind of sits underneath here, it applies to being up there. And it might not be on the actual airport site, but the surrounding area around the airport. So just knowing that that is a kind of like a tool for the toolbox for economic development being associated with the airport, which is one of the primary reasons, one of the primary reasons that the township purchased that site in the first place back in 2009. I think it was 2009. It was right around the time frame. Purchasing of the airport, that was around 2009, I think, when all is said and done. 7 to 9, yep. That's correct, okay. And thank you for that. So we'll go ahead and hop into the first priority here, which is strong financial management. This isn't necessarily like a franchise function of cost versus, revenue and expenditures. This is just kind of dictates how we're practicing the implementation of public funding and tracking it from point A to point B throughout. So this was probably the number 1 focus starting last year, rolling over into this year, because you're only as effective as a local government for how you can manage your finances. If you can't do that, you really can't implement and keep things going. And of course, that's not just me saying that out loud. That's part of the National Accepted Standards for the Government Finance Officers Association, as well as the National Advisory Council on State and Local Budgeting. So they say it's important. It's probably something that you should be focusing on. So with that, we've been very active internally within our administrative function to seek improvements for internally kind of structuring, not just how we process things, but also how we communicate those things as well. And so a big part was in terms of the kind of FY22 rolling into FY23 initiative was just completing a forensic audit, kind of provide a summary level of understanding of improvements for internal controls. We, of course, implemented a significant amount of those. We provided that update last year, going into this year as well. Of course, all of our staff recommendation reports for agenda items have a financial component to it. So everybody, as they're following along the business agenda, can see how it rolls up to a general fund line item or capital fund line item or enterprise fund line item perspective. And of course, in terms of budgeted amount versus budgeted requested and existing spend on those line items as well. We also in 23 kind of shifted the priority towards using our open space fund revenues to support some ongoing maintenance needs. And that's one where we'll talk about it towards the end part of the brief. There are some rules within Act 32, which defines open space, just the function in of itself in local government in terms of what financial resource you can harness the energy of based off of just what your strength in that fund balance versus that in your revenue amount is for you. So 24, we were pretty active from the jump. Biggest part was adopting our fiscal policy. I believe that was in the early summer, late spring timeframe. If people want to go back and reference that, it's in the agenda. But essentially that defines kind of the categorical areas of managing local government finances, from just definition of what your structural fund or your structural budgeting parameters should be, all the way to how you manage debt. So it's everything across the board. But that was helpful because when you have your audit statements, your fiscal policy, your ability to kind of show a strong kind of approach to framing budgeting and the mixture of financial transactions, that makes you more viable for something like this when you can get an actual established credit rating, which, just to answer anybody's questions up front, no, we don't have a current credit rating at all as a township. That was seen as a priority because sans having some really great interest rates, by not having that, you're already kind of making yourself a little bit worse when you're talking about funding and financing for projects. Just some other things. These were mostly harnessing kind of internal improvements for enhancements around technology and, of course, how we communicate. And that's a big piece of it, too, because if you're doing the job internally and you're having a good sense of how you're getting it done, it's also helpful to have the community understand how well you're doing it as well. So a lot of the things that we're looking at are to improve the township's ability to increase financial transparency. Just a review of where we were at last year when we talked about 24 goals. The biggest one out there was balancing the budget. If you can put yourself into this time frame last year, the way that the budget was passed just to start the fiscal year of 23, as we were in the middle of executing it, it was passed with a 1.8 structural deficit into the actual budget in itself. Now, we did some budget amendments, and part of that was to kind of eliminate some of the noise within overstated revenues due to grants and ARPA funding and a lot of that stuff that came in through a lot of localities. But it was just that function of having a structural use of cash defined as the primary mechanism to balance the budget, and that number was $1.8 million starting off last year. Now, when we got that more kind of cleaned away, that ended up being around about $1 million. And of course, that led into the need to improve the tax rate, not say improve, increase the tax rate, excuse me. And then for this year, use interest income to balance the budget from proceeds of the sewer sale, which was another part of the thing that we did, which was leverage our fiscal strength. For right now, that's generating revenue out of, I'll call it a non-standard asset that pretty much all localities don't have, which is a significant cash balance. From this case, it was from the remaining proceeds of the sewer sale. So right now, and this was done in about March, I think, of this year, just kind of updating about our investment strategy as it comes to using that $22 million to basically achieve the amount of net interest income we use for cash. And of course, when we went into 24 planning, we used a lot of that interest income to fund operations at the behest of not doing the whole scale tax increase that we were recommending to completely essentially level the budget. And we used a lot of surplus rollover from a prior year to fund capital. Of course, that's a temporary solution, and it's one where it's not sustainable. We can talk about some of the reasons for why that is in a bit, but it's just one where it kind of says that we're using every tool that we have at our disposal to address the township's overarching issue, which is we're still based off of our assessed needs, cash, strength, revenue, kind of weakness, if that makes sense. Another one, too, for priority was funding critical capital projects, just kind of a blanket statement. Everything that we do for capital infrastructure is never going to be as cheap as it is today. So if you defer, you defer, you defer, and you get into an instance where you're deferring not just for 1, 2, but 5, 10 years, you get into the point where that capital need is exponentially higher than it was 10, 5, even 2 years prior. And now you're in a worse position to be able to finance that without using what most governments try to avoid, which is a significant amount of debt. So we're still very much trying to execute that pay-go cash strategy, if you will, and just generate enough cash using a source of multiple revenue streams just to get that basic capital kind of need per year complete and get through a lot of these projects that have been kind of put on the shelf and deferred for multiple years, probably even decades prior. Another one was organizational staffing issues. Kind of one of the biggest needs when I came to the township in the very beginning of 23 is we were basically missing an entire department. We had nothing serving our community and land development function. We had one consultant who was part-time for about 4 hours twice a week. And we were unable to clean house with all of the backlog of permit activity, as well as land development functions, as well as just kind of the ongoing function of property maintenance code inspections, just the full gamut of community development. Of course, we also still weren't doing anything related to our rental inspection program to make sure that housing is adequate at a level of safety for renters within the township, as well as adopting the 2018 fire code, International Fire Code, which allows us to conduct the more fire marshal traditional function of doing commercial building inspections and just making sure that all of our commercial grade buildings within the township are up to their fire code that they need to be. And of course, all of that helps lower, I'll call it the preventative measures that you can take as a locality to help your fire company out by making sure that you're addressing things before they happen rather than after, when you probably can't really address them. Another one was just making sure that our public works staffing compensation, as well as the ability to fund prior unfilled positions based off of that issue. 24 was a strategy to fix that as well for planning purposes. And then, of course, how we achieve ROI on capital projects. That's another big one. Which one should be seen as measures to get better ROI, if you will. And of course, a big part of that, if you're doing a cash function strategy, you also want to look at who can actually supply kind of that front end component of it, which is applying for a significant amount of grants to make sure that your overall net contribution is at the lowest possible component or percentage, excuse me, that it can be. So if you're just applying for grants across the board, that's great, but certain grants, they might be $1 million, but if it's a 50% match, you're on the hook for half of that. So it really depends on which grants you can go to, how well you can get somebody in the seat dedicated to submit all the required documentation as well as narratives. It's a function in and of itself, and that's one that was a missing piece of the puzzle and a recommended priority for the township to fund that position. And of course, for the past year or so, we've been funding that with remaining ARPA funding that we still have on hook coming through. I think that's going to be depleted as at the beginning of FY25. And then also just, hey, if we can get some of these planning projects underway, these are ones that are kind of seen as an immediate investment because they inform future land use things that we need to get done. So the ROI on that is do it now because they are significant improvements to your long-term viability, in this case, for transportation improvements as well as economic development. And then, of course, just I kind of alluded to it already. We just wanted to address some inefficiencies with our internal approach to how we looked at budgeting. Of course, a big part of that was transparency and communications around that. So we've been very, very busy administratively. Also, just some priority considerations. The biggest priority that was done is just achieving sustainable revenue growth over time. So this isn't something the township was ignoring. It's just a lot of these projects hadn't necessarily been kicked off and put into active land development applications, excuse me. So that's one right now where we do have two moving forward. We're trying to certainly execute our zoning map project that we're currently actively implementing. I think we're going to be coming up on another public outreach meeting in September. Activate the White Clay Point development. We'll go into some of the issues with why it is the way that it is right now today, as well as just like I said, when you're creating revenue out of nothing, implementing a community development department can help you achieve increasing revenues for permits, increasing revenues for those fees associated with just land development activities. And then you can have enough people to be able to understand what your fees should be at. Should you be increasing those fees? What are those kind of market, I'll call it viable rates schedules at? And then you can improve your, I'll call it your fee revenue growth over time as well with that. So it's more people looking at it who are subject matter experts in their fields, who are able to, in this instance, apply modern kind of best practices, and then you have enough people to actually execute it, and of course that revenue goes up. And if you remember as long ago as last week when we talked about the budget amendment, we saw that. We saw those improvements and the actual permit activity in the township, so that was great to see. Of course, just kind of giving people a sense of what this means if these two developments kind of kick off in full maturity. We're talking about roughly about a 225 to 250,000 net increase. And I'll call it the primary two, which is your real estate and earned income taxes. This, of course, doesn't account for permit revenues, transfer taxes, kind of those intermittent one-time types of revenues that come in. But of course, where they're at today, where they essentially all got tipped into a more defined active land development application, it takes time. So you're not likely to see those revenues until FY26. So you have to plan accordingly by managing your expenditures along the way until those revenues kick in. Another one is wholesaling regional public safety services. If you're 60% of your budget, excuse me, I think it's a little bit less than that, is wrapped up into funding police and funding fire and EMS. And that's one where you look at the kind of the broader picture and talk about just kind of what it means as these service costs increase. As a township that has everything, and I can say that because certain townships and localities don't fund everything, it's one where trying to figure out how you can manage this is probably the single most important aspect of managing the cost increases for your general fund. We already alluded to reassessing of capital priorities. And also another one is just understanding what we're acquiring in our open space plan. But when I talk about emphasize public infrastructure, of course, prior to arriving here at the township, some of the biggest projects were associated with implementation of parks, not necessarily implementation of roads and infrastructure. So that's when I said talk about reprioritizing. It's shifting the dialogue to say that these are probably the biggest capital liabilities in the township. And if we don't start addressing those now with a sustainable revenue plan in place to help it along the way, it's only going to compound and get worse, because based off of when we built out as a township, which was roughly in the 80s and 90s, a lot of that infrastructure is coming due. Another one is for those park projects, it's structuring a implementable master plan for all those projects and then sourcing funding from cash areas where it's not coming from general fund tax revenues. So it's either coming from earned income tax for open space funds or it's coming from grants. But that's kind of the primary mechanism. And another one too is, and this is after talking with our open space review board, when we talk about future open space land acquisitions, just make sure it doesn't have a land or trail value, and also implement and what's on the property in and of itself is another big part of that too. Because if you inherit 100 acres of flat kind of prairie land or farmscape, that's one thing. If you inherit New Garden Hills or St. Anthony's with like 15 different structures and it's a kind of a very tumultuous piece of property, it's just another, I'll call it another complexity, I'll call it, for implementing a vision, if you will. And then of course, I think this one was kind of the beating the drum on this for a while. We have to unlock some of the assets that we have in the township to get some economic development initiatives to address some of these revenue needs that we've been talking about as well for new growth. And then of course, the dialogue goes into what type of growth and where. And then I think I've already kind of talked about the missing asset management plans, but it's good to know what you currently have identified. It's another thing to understand what you don't necessarily know is a liability. And then as soon as you get these things done, you're looking at a much larger price tag because the inventory of updated infrastructure needs goes through the roof because you're just looking at it more. And we're currently actively looking to implement a stormwater, I don't call it an inventory and asset plan, but looking at all culverts, looking at all, I'll call them like critical infrastructure weak points within the township, and understanding what is the grading of that infrastructure and how much is it a risk to the township. And then you look at that list. Act 209 provides that same component, but it's through transportation infrastructure improvements for intersection areas that we're going through right now. But it's the same thing. You're looking at an intersection today, but we don't have an objective benchmark of how much improving that intersection actually costs. At the end of the Act 209 process, we will have that information. It's just how big is that number going to be? So just looking at general fund, this is just more of a review, so I'll try to just go through this because I believe this has been also a continuous topic for a lot of the discussions when we talk about our general fund. But if you can think in terms of revenue, we have sustainable revenues and then we have non-sustainable revenues. So sustainable is everything that's sourced from an actual levy that goes out in terms of a rate or a percentage based off of your tax base. That's seen as a sustainable, quote unquote, if you will, revenue. Another one too is just based off of your permit fee, your fee schedule, whatever you have out there. That's your fee. That's the cost for doing business within the township as defined and approved by the Board of Supervisors on an annual basis. And then we have non-sustainable. And right now we have about 15% of our township revenue coming from non-sustainable revenues. And a big part of that is interest income. As long as the principal balance is what it is and the rates are what they are, you're going to get that level of sustained revenue. The problem is those rates never stay in place. And it's one where also if you get into a situation where you have to use cash from that principal, you're just going to continually kind of deplete that down. It can create kind of a compounding effect, if you will. And then of course, it's just your own saved cash on hand that we have. But if you're not actively replenishing that with transfers to those reserve positions because you don't have the money to do that, that's non-sustainable revenue. So with that, as of the budget amount for FY24, this is of course with the 1.05 tax rate increase to get us to 2.77 that was approved last year. This is kind of the percentage breakdown for still the majority of our revenue comes from earned income tax. That's our #1 revenue as a township. And of course, that's Act 511's component of it, and you add up to get all of these kind of Act 511 type summary taxes. And then of course you have your real estate taxes. Now we don't have a fire fund, but in our budget, we like to at least line item out what that alignment of property tax funding is towards fire services, just to show kind of what that would look like. And then keep on bumping in this thing. I got to move this thing out of the way. The other part here is just the percentage for miscellaneous fees and revenues as well. The good news is in our budget amendment, this number, because of revenues coming from fees, is going to be going up because we invested into a community development department. So this percentage is likely to go up in terms of a portion of revenue. And then of course there's the actual, because everyone likes pie charts. So there you go. There's the pie chart to make it easy. Now in terms of real estate taxes, just to kind of get everybody kind of to understand where the principal portion of your real estate tax goes towards, it goes towards schools. So in Pennsylvania, specifically those for second-class townships, you have a school district component, you have a county component, and then you have a local township component. And that's one where the KCSD, I say that Consolidated School District average debt millage rate is actually higher than our holistic millage rate. So they mill as a school district more for debt than we do for our entire township. And that just kind of gives you the scale of disparity between the two enterprises, or excuse me, the two organizations. And then of course, another impact on taxing for revenues, assuming for real estate, comes from property tax assessments, which Chester County, it's going on about 26 years now, where they haven't done an assessment or reassessment, excuse me. And that's one where you really see kind of the gap, because your assessable values of property creates tax revenue component to help fund services like fire. And it's one where you're underfunding fire to save property that's actually valued at a much higher value. And there's a huge gap there. So you're depressing scaled ability to provide fire services, protect property that's much, much more valuable than what it's assessed at. And that's an issue. That's kind of where I like to tell people the disparity between why does the assessment have to be updated? That's a big part of it. Once again, people like pie charts. So the Pac-Man symbol over there, the biggest part of that is, of course, Kennet Consolidated School District. You have the county share, which is a roughly around a little over 11%. And then even after, I think what the message was a 60% increase. Even after a 60% increase, we're still less than 7% of the overall property tax millage for your property as well. And this is kind of the years of growth last decade of that, where even with that 1 to 2 jump here, which was about a 75% increase, I like to kind of say that at the end of the day, you're talking about bigger jumps at lower scales there, just because of the footprint that's already been established. So the township could effectively double its tax rate and still be as a lowest percentage of the scale of the portion of total property taxes. Kind of gives you an understanding of the issue in of itself, which is we're very limited in how much we can kind of continue to tap into property tax increases, because it's already oversaturated with funding schools. What we didn't do last year, just because I didn't have the data, but was able to kind of get it sourced from Keystone Collections Group, of course, anonymized for individual, what do they call it, personal information and stuff. So it kind of provides it at a summary level with some earned income tax information, because this is kind of the missing part of the discussion when we talk about your tax base and kind of what makes up that tax base. And I think it's important for people to understand that this is how your #1 revenue is sourced from. So with that, we get kind of buckets of installments that average out to be quarterly payments to the township. So this is something where we get all of our bucketed money for real estate property tax revenues in April, because that's when the bills come, and we get it kind of rolling in April and May. Earned income taxes throughout the year. So it's very important. That's good, because your need to fund continuous operations with a sizable, biggest part of your revenues coming in on a monthly basis helps not have missing like gaps, like of revenue gaps to be able to fund services. So that's actually a good, I'll call it sustainable revenue throughout the year. But with that, The way that they provide the reporting is based into two buckets. So they report on just businesses that have your residents in terms of employer withholdings. So think of this as they'll have a listed business, summary of total employees at that place and what the net amount is per year for that. So in this instance, of all of our workforce, we have about 790 total businesses reporting for the workforce. These aren't New Garden businesses. These are just if you live in the township and if you're an individual, I work for myself business, or you're part of one of the larger businesses that we have in the township, you're just one of the 790 individual companies listed there. So this entire 790 is about 6,700 workforce employees because you just do the entire employee count summary there. Now with that, they also do resident workforce. So this is one where this is just individual addresses associated with a earned income taxpayer, and you just do a count. So with that, we have, 5,500 people. So then you can kind of do a one-to-one analysis of that and say, of our entire earned income tax, 80% comes from residents. It doesn't come from people driving and working within New Garden Township. Now, you might have a resident who works within New Garden Township, but they would count here, as well as be part of that summary total in there, if that makes sense. And that's good to understand because if you are anchored in earned income tax at about 80% of those revenues, a big part of that is half of that goes to the school. So automatically your entire base, which is the biggest portion of your earned income tax coming from residents for New Garden Township, it's a 50-50 split with the school district. So there's a sense of inefficiency there when you take your biggest strength and you cut it in half essentially, even before you can understand. I'll say the where is that revenue going for in schools? Where is it going for I'll call it township specific, and excuse me, I'll start over that one again because I lost my train of thought here. Yeah, so a better way to say that is the resident workforce being portioned out between 80% coming from residents. It's good to know that if you were to grow a new business within the township, and let's say you don't have sufficient housing, so people from that company could come in and work and live in the township. That's one where they have to live in a locality within Pennsylvania in order to not have their earned income tax go back to their community. So then you start understanding what is the strategy for business onboarding, and this kind of rolls into the economic development, I'll call it function. So it's what companies are coming in, where their employee workforce coming from. So is it something locally but outside the state? There's a lot of factors that go into it, but since this is the biggest scalable part of that revenue, that's one where you really want to understand what the inner workings of earned income tax means. And that's a much cleaner way of trying to get what I was trying to say across the board there. So another one is just what is our EIT base? So with that, of the businesses that are listed within that 790. So within that, I just wanted to look at the top 25. What are the best 25, I'm gonna say best, the biggest 25 businesses within New Garden Township? And of course, this ranges by employee count. So we have businesses that range from 50 plus employees to 300 employees. So you can probably kind of start understanding which businesses these are in the township. 16 were agricultural, ag-related industries. When I say ag-related, I think of that food, kind of cold storage, supply chain industry component of it, but it's good to know that that is a significant part just in terms of just raw employee count. Of the 25 business by net EIT amount. So this is just if you have a lot of employees, you're probably going to have a larger EIT amount number. 12 were ag-related industries. So that kind of gives you a sense of the top 25. Half of them are coming from that kind of, I'll call it industry footprint, if you will. Now, the one part is if you do it by net per employee, none were agricultural or agri-supply chain related. So that gives you an understanding that while they have a sizable amount of scale, the per employee value of those types of industry functions per employee is actually much, much lower. So it provides kind of a big part of the base of the foundation, but in terms of value add for additional types of employee kind of organizations and industries, I'm gonna move this thing right now because I keep on backing into it. Just to get a sense of what types of businesses you're trying to attract and incentivize to locate within New Garden Township. And that's one where new industries like to cluster around existing industries. And the fact that our biggest industry is agriculture, it's kind of a constraint because it's very easy to incentivize onboarding for future agricultural industries, but they're not necessarily providing the biggest return to the township, if that makes sense. In fact, I've tried to go down the list, and the highest ranking per employee per business for ag or ag-related was 353rd out of 790 total businesses. So it's, like I said, it's part of that big base, but in terms of the ranking of it, it's kind of around the midpoint for the highest performing one. And of course, this is just a breakdown for the earned income tax total of the schools. So this is one that's just kind of saying, you know, in all, the township earns about 5.1 million in revenue, but New Garden only gets about 2.8 because a significant part of that is residentially based, which means half of that also goes to the school district, if that makes sense. This is just a quick summary overview of our expenditures. There's another pie chart. So I used this in a prior budgeting slide, but essentially we have three significant components that make up a large portion of our expenditures. And then we have kind of, I'll call this the remaining part of the wheel that's all serving a very specific function from a compliance need for the township for the most part. So it's like, it's very tough to kind of strip away here, and it's very hard to have all of this within a second-class township budget if revenue increases are one of your biggest hurdles, if that makes sense. So the fact that we have to fund all of that at the scale that is required to support those cost areas, that is your strategy, I'll call it. You might want to start looking here to see what you can do before you start looking here, because there's not a whole lot else you can really do.
Mm-hmm. And Chris, in that you have fire, EMS, and
Southern Chester County EMS.
ALS.
Yep.
Perfect.
And we're going to go into public safety services later on. But yeah, I lump it into just fire, but it's everything. So 5-year expenditure strategy. So this, of course, is more of an update on what does 25 to 29 kind of look like in terms of influence on expenditures. So really, if you just kind of say that 24 was planned to be more of an accurate depiction of expenses, what does that future expenditure growth look like? And the biggest influence in that, because of our position right now for servicing revenue to support capital needs, the biggest influence on our plan comes from funding capital. That's our biggest limitation right now. So if we want to see continuous improvements for roads, if we want to attack stormwater issues, we need to find a way to fund it. Because right now it's on a level where there's not a lot of ways that we can kind of pull that lever and have it be something from either A, growing the tax base, or B, growing the tax rate. So already looking into FY25, you know, we need to provide that interest income that was used as a bridge gap solution to not incur a larger significant tax increase from last year, and put that back into capital, because we're already looking at sourcing needs for updated capital to source that road kind of improvement paving program, as well as some other capital needs for infrastructure issues related to stormwater. And if we don't use this as an asset that is right now set to decrease because of rates, you know, we're going to be missing out on replacing some of those capital needs. And that's one where the strategy has always been interest to support capital, kind of like a separation of where the revenue should be aligned with. Another one too is, even with this kind of repatriation of interest back in the capital fund, we're still going to need to look to increase our transfers to capital, because right now, historically, they're stronger than they were from the last few years. Let's say anything prior to FY20, there were some years where there was significant transfer to capital years, and then they kind of went down to, I'll call it the bare minimums. We're kind of growing up just a little bit of that, but we really right now source about 243K. And if we want to remain on a sustainable path, we're going to need to increase that by 500K, so up to about 750K per year, just to be able to fund capital and, of course, replenish some of those capital reserves. So if we do the expenditure growth with the transfer to capital increase, it's about 10% growth for the next few years in expenditures. If we do 5-year total estimated growth without the transfer to capital, it's about 1.7. So we have very, I'll call it nominal expenditure growth forecasted for the next 5 years if we don't do capital. If we do capital, you can see where that kind of jump comes from. So one is also inclusive of White Clay Point, but it includes kind of forecast development. What does this net additional revenue mean? This kind of helps you get healthy when it comes to supporting your operating budget expenditures, and also doesn't include transfer tax, local service tax, and miscellaneous revenues coming into that too. So it's like, if if we can harness the energy of some of the, we'll call it outstanding economic development related land development applications, you can take a significant part of your revenue needs and source that funding to where it needs to go. So that's seen as a significant chunk of revenue to support where we need to go. But it doesn't cover all of those needs, because you can raise this much money and still not have the ability to fund capital extra to it. So it's not a lifesaver, I guess is the way that it doesn't fix all of your revenue shortages. Another one too is just when you're likely to see all of that mature revenue coming in from all those finalized land developments. That's one where you probably won't see everything until 27 and 28. So that's 3 or 4 more years from now. So it's how do we get to that point to be able to realize that revenue growth, and then kind of come up with a different way to finance capital priorities. So another one too is the cost of lever of interest income revenue in the general fund and sustain a low tax rate while awaiting revenue increases. So like I said, you're kind of waiting in this period where you're trying to get these land developments complete. What do you do until then? And so we're looking internally right now at kind of everything across the board, because it's not going to be one solution. So we're already looking at this, which is increasing the use of the open space fund to not only not only to subsidize the cost for park implementation projects, but also to cover the cost of parks operating requirements as well. And that's Parks Department function, if you will. So we're going to continue to try to lessen the burden within the general fund. Another one too is if you do have good years where you have generated surplus, normally you would take that surplus and source it into a reserve position. You would do a kind of like a one-time project kind of component to it. This is where we can actually, instead of using structural cash from just budgeted cash, we would take net surplus earned in that year and push it as added revenue for the next year. So you're basically taking prior surplus and applying it to future expenditures. Leverage the retired surplus. So we have some, I'll call it legacy funds that we had established. One was the recreation fund, one was the New Garden Hills fund. It's about 190,000 of just cash in there. You can you can utilize that just as like a temporary solution there if you just need some added revenues, because those would be offsetting those general fund expenditures related to just recreation services. And of course, you can always increase your fees for service as well. That's kind of something that's seen as you're doing business within the township. We want to make sure that that is something that you're getting charged at the correct rates, so you can harness that revenue as well. And then of course, you always want to retool your investment strategy. Unfortunately, right now, that's at a net kind of reduced position or decreasing position. So we're going to have to do that anyway. And then if planned revenue growth from new development is unsuccessful, this is kind of the worst case scenario, because we're always talking about kind of the rosy picture, the pie in the sky, but also you have to prepare for the worst outcomes. That's one where you're going to have to take those net proceeds of interest income, regardless of what percentage rate it's applied at, and you're going to have to put that back into the general fund just to make sure you're not spending cash. That's the biggest component for general fund solvency. You're going to have to reduce capital expenditures with that. So it's kind of a, not one or the, not reducing the position of one. You almost have to stop doing certain level of capital. So you would just have to say that priorities and funding operations. So therefore, we are not going to do capital, at least for a few years. And it's also to let people know about $8.1 million of our tentative FY25 expenditure plan is on roads and stormwater projects. So I'm saying defer capital, I'm talking about deferring infrastructure projects. Increase taxes is another one, and then cut services. Those are kind of, those are your options really when you talk about if you're not able to achieve development growth, increasing your tax base. So the proposed CIP, so right now we're looking to do the CIP actual presentation on September 9th as part of workshop number 2. But you can see right here, like 80% of your total 5-year CIP cost is coming from kind of 3 categorical areas. And really it's coming from paving, if you want to think about it. Because at the end of the day, when I tell people about stormwater projects, it's like we don't really do stormwater here. And that's not necessarily to say it's not a priority. It's just stormwater projects are increasingly more and more expensive. And it's one where if you don't have dedicated revenue just coming in to support improving that, kind of like a utility fund, and we'll talk about like stormwater fees that have been enacted in Pennsylvania, you're really not going to be able to address stormwater capital needs. And then this was as of our year-end FY23 cash, assuming this is the proposed cash plan to support that. And this is kind of what I was talking about, kind of where your net cash position. So at the end of the day, these are all your sourceful revenues coming in from year in, year out basis. And then you have kind of a starting fund balance, which this year we're starting at about $2.3 million in our capital reserve. But then, of course, that is to apply towards capital projects. You got to get the capital needs addressed. And so with that, this is with that year one increase of interest income dedicated towards capital. And that's also one where you're seeing it kind of go down. That's because rates are going down. So they're forecast to go down year over year between where we were about 5.5% last year. They're probably going to be down around 2% maybe, which is great if you're buying a home, but if you're trying to use interest to support capital, it's not so great. And then, of course, this also accounts for that planned increase bump and transfers to revenue here. That's why I highlighted those areas so you can see it. So those are kind of where I'm talking about specifically. And that gets us into, I'll call it an yearly annual balance, if you will, because you don't want this to get down to zero or near zero, because if you do, if you have a cost overrun for a project, if you have something, and that's going to happen, you get yourself into a non-sourceable cash position to fund projects. And so that's one where you might start on a project that takes 2 years. And if you run out of cash, then you have to defer the completion of that project, which is only going to be incrementally more expensive to do. And then, of course, the big, list of cash that we have from all of our fund balances. But the way I kind of tell people, if this is your most liquefiable cash fund reserve positions you have, you want to keep general fund reserve in a position that is a percentage of an emergency funding for your general fund itself. So you want to have, most localities try to get to about 25 to 35%, which we're currently at. And that was after raising taxes and using interest income to kind of stop the hemorrhaging out of our cash position there. So you can see kind of where it was going down. And then another one too is, this is one where you build up to build it back to spend it down. You build it up to spend it down. That's your cash reserve position. Everything else is kind of just earmarked as a interest income generating little bucket fund here. But the biggest one, of course, is your sewer fund proceeds right there. And what it's doing in terms of increasing revenues. This was generated interest surplus that was already spent in terms of FY23 rollover into FY24 projects. So we were able to pave Pemberton Road because of a bigger portion of this interest surplus rollover. We were able to complete the town hall roof, which is estimated to start roughly about mid-September timeframe because of this interest surplus rollover without financing the roof. So this is kind of showing kind of where all the cash positions are. You look at all of these, but all of these are restricted funds. You can't use these on general fund purposes. So you might have a strong net cash position, but what is restricted, what is liquefiable, that's where things kind of start to get a little more constrained in what you're able to do. All right, so that's a lot of financial talk for the most part. We can do this in terms of questions right now. If you want to briefly pause, and I can roll through because we're about slide 20 of about 70-ish. So I just want to say it's, coming back to this now, or excuse me, do you want to talk about matters related to financials now, or do you want to move on to just the other summary categories here?
Well, Steve and I were just discussing the economic value of the Copper Ridge alone.
Yep.
It just transferred for 3.3 million.
Yep.
Like 3 days ago. So we're going to get $16,500 for that, which
That's
is not going to help.
A
but,
0.5%.
Yeah.
Yep.
But when those 98 townhomes sell for $500,000 each, then you have $49 million of value. That's when you get $250,000.
Correct.
So
Yep.
just to illustrate.
That could be over 3 years.
And of
Right.
course, that was applied at the Chester County existing tax assessment values, correct?
Well, that's not going to change because that's the 1% transfer tax.
Correct, because that's
Yeah.
what I make sure to communicate. Even if you have a new build, it's assessed at existing properties. So you might have a brand new house, but it's being comparatively assessed against properties that are 30 years older than it. So it automatically says if you build $1 million worth of housing, in actuality, it's net $500,000 in terms of its total assessable valuation of it in terms of what we apply the tax rate to.
Right.
It's kind of like the inefficiency baked into that one too. But you're right, it should be somewhere around, with EIT and property tax, somewhere between 200,000 to 300,000. I think I had it around 250-ish. And that's of course added to the potential white clay, which I think in prior iterations was about 600. That's how you got to that 833 number. But no, that's a great point. And the good news is, at least from that one, they're already starting their land development process too. So I think they're already applying for permits. I think Thompson
Yeah.
Property is actively in a state where they're applying for demolition permits. So those projects are moving forward.
And then to really quickly push my enthusiasm for density is that that's done on, how many acres was that, Steve? 25? 30?
Which one?
Copper Ridge.
No, that's 16 acres.
Yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head, so I don't want to speak.
Okay.
Someone wants to be an enterprising official and go on Chesco Views and look at the two parcels divided for the old Modern Mushroom site that's now Bancroft Rouse Chamberlain site, they can do so. But you're right, if you build a light density product on a large swath of land, you're automatically losing value there.
Yeah.
Because the ability from a cost perspective to support those areas isn't one where there's a direct linear relationship. So it's not like for every dollar spent, we have a dollar added. And I know there's been some metrics kind of put against cost for community services, but those cost of community service metric projections are influenced heavily by the cost for schools, but not for township requirements, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, that obviously goes into the property influence for taxpayers, but it's not, we are not the driving factor for driving up the reason for why that is.
Right. So it's only 20 acres off the market instead of 100 acres.
Correct, yep. All right, we'll hop into economic development. I like to provide just a very summary definition level of economic development because people sometimes conflate economic development with just, I'll call it like a subdevelopment, and it's very much kind of two individual enterprises. You can have subdevelopments happen in your area that are completely unmanaged by somebody actively trying to influence an outcome by doing, I'll call it more deliberate approach to economic development. So it's the one where you're trying to improve your economic base with sustained revenue growth over time to support services and by encouraging new businesses and development to locate within the new garden. So you're actively out there recruiting. So you're looking for industries with a certain portion of jobs that are market viable for their interest in your area. And then you're trying to go through all of the constraints that are seen as reasons for why they might not. And you try to tip those no's into yeses. That is managed economic development. It's something that as a township, all townships don't really do in Pennsylvania because it's seen as like a premium type of community function. And for now, economic development in Chester County is really only managed by one independent agency, which is the Chester County Economic Development Council. And I think they're a body of a very small group of people that service the entire county, which means they're doing support for the county, but then the 100-esque municipalities within Chester County. So they have a lot of mouths to feed. So it's like, how much of the attention are you really getting from them for your individual locality? But if you can get their attention, they can provide a lot of tools for the toolbox here. And the biggest one they can do is to help with I'll call it the public financing component of the potential cost for doing an incentivized project within your locality, as well as they can do a lot of workforce development assistance. They can help kind of broker that relationship with the state for tax incentives, because that's one thing that we really can't do is we can't support tax incentives for commercial properties or individual properties. Everyone gets the same base rate across the board, where there might be other types of larger state level tax structures that they can work with. And of course, in this case, CCD brokers that onboarding process, if that makes sense. Things that we can do is we can make sure that we are fit for purpose when it comes to our zoning, fit for purpose when it comes to kind of commissionable sites within the area. So you've already identified opportunities and you have a kind of structured understanding of how to harness that energy. And then of course, making sure that you're actively out there breaking out from I think there's about 1,900 second-class townships in Pennsylvania. You're trying to be the noisiest one in the line because you want to get the attention, because it's very hard for people to understand what is it about your community that makes it so special to get our attention. And that's just in Pennsylvania. Companies don't look at just, I'm going to do business here. They look at a macro kind of level view. So they're like, I can do business anywhere. So now you're competing with other states, and the list goes on, other countries even as well. So it's a very complex function, if you will, based off of the scale of what you're operating at. So what spurs interest? One of the biggest factors is just where you are. You're going to be more viable for certain things located where we are along the I-95 corridor amongst a bunch of mega cities along the eastern seaboard versus somewhere in the, the bread belt of the country. It's just two different types of areas. Local demographics, just how many people are in your area, are they kind of seen as workforce viable? And then if you're, let's say, a business going in to anchor around the ability to make sales, you want to have a certain demographic with a purchasing power within that area too. So like certain types of businesses have different reasons for why they come to the table. And then just available sites. If everything is already a built-out environment and all the opportunity is around redevelopment, that's one thing. If it's just completely unspeculative land, that's another one. If it's one where there's a shell for something they can easily move into, that's another. A lot of these are just, I'll call it unique factors that you either have them or you don't. But it's good to know what your assets are to make sure that you're aligning. It's kind of like a matchmaking function. You're taking X site and saying that would be a good fit for you. And then you get that connection made. So it's generating leads management is what they call it. So based on the above, what do we have strengths here? Regional location, we're just in a great spot in terms of just activity in the area around the Mid-Atlantic. We have strong AMIs. Granted, we don't have dense AMIs, but we have strong AMIs in the area. And of course, we do have a big publicly owned site in the airport development zone that we'll talk about here in a bit. But it's one where that is almost 100 acres of township or publicly owned land. How do we harness that to be able to do like an active economic development project? Weaknesses, this isn't just us, this is just probably a lot of places in Pennsylvania, not a lot of existing infrastructure. So everything has to be improved by the developer. And that's one where someone can go in and go, I'm looking at that number and I'm saying, I don't have to deal with that in that state, that state, that state, that state. So we're moving on. And that's a line in the sand type of moment. So certain people won't even look at our area because they know that there's just no viability to it. And then other ones in terms of just low housing density. So I know if I'm going to put my business here, but all my workforce is going to have to commute from like an hour away, that's not seen as a viable solution either as well. So you kind of have to have a way to say, if this is weaknesses, do we have the ability to improve this? If we don't, do we have enough strengths to overcome our weaknesses? So location, I think this came up in an earlier conversation, but it's kind of defining of your community. So when you approach somebody and say, hey, what is New Garden? I say it's a residential bedroom community that has a lot of agriculture in it. So it's one where what that really means in terms of a 50-50 split, but that's what we are. So these have a certain sense of interest because certain businesses will say, hey, I kind of want to be around this, and certain other businesses say, hey, I kind of want to be around this. The good news is we at least have the flexibility to pivot to either or. It's just what is the return, and I alluded to that at least in terms of income tax, what that means. Another one is just like I said, the location, commuter distance. We're in a relatively strong position because you can kind of see the clustering of development, but we're just more dense here, extremely dense up there. We're not too far away from it, and we're the border state or border township that has a state highway that goes right down to the epicenter of one of those localities, those urban centers. So that's already different if you're just these townships over here, because you don't have that connective tissue, even on the other side as well. So it's one where just where we are makes us inherently interesting to at least have discussions. Another one too is, I already alluded to this one along, but we didn't talk about US Route 1 as a growth corridor. And so we're kind of sandwiched in between the two of them. And then of course we have two large-scale commercial airports within the area that are at least, I guess, depending on traffic and this part of 95 of how fast you can get to the Philadelphia International Airport, but it's also one where Newcastle County is growing significantly as well in terms of their commercial airport support as well. Population and housing is a big component of it. It's one where understanding New Garden's history kind of helps there, but we had our population boom in the last 30 years more front-loaded. So the 90s was our heyday, and that's kind of where we had almost a 50% increase in our population. And then, of course, it came to pretty much a screeching halt over the course of the 2010 timeframe. But how we developed was also important to know. So we had all the space, and we very lightly filled it in. And that created kind of an inefficiency in terms of density. So the real issue is even if we were to do hyper-dense development right on like the Route 41 corridor or anything like that, it's still not going to achieve that macro density component of everything. So it's more of a Band-Aid on that dialogue, but it's never going to really structurally change this right here, which is we have about a little over 1 resident per acre density within the township. And of course, we talked about it stagnating, and then you can kind of see that playing out here. And these are DVRPC. So this is open source information. As everyone's ever been to that website, they have a data portal. I think the last time they updated this was a moving count of 2017 to 2021, I think it is. Excuse me, 2017 to 2021. That's their moving average. They just haven't updated it a little bit forward. But as of 21, a lot of this stuff still rings true. And then, of course, they have us estimated for their future population counts by about 14,500. So you're saying, okay, so even and this is one of the more conservative ones. I think there was a 2015 Kennett comp plan update that was done to show that they were more aggressive in their estimates. This is the more conservative one. So the most conservatives has us growing about 3,100 people in the next 25 years. And that's not a whole lot if you think about it. But it's one where if that is what we're going to be viable for, we should start thinking now, where do we want to put these 3,100 people and where and why? And that's kind of some of the issues, some of the dialogue that we're having right now through our zoning, through our Act 209. These are very tantamount to understanding this is the goal, this is the execution. Housing and income is another big component of demographic influence on economic development. As of, I think it was even last year, we're about 130K in terms of just AMI, which is average median household income. And that's one where 130 as just a raw number seems pretty strong. It's good to know that that's part of a averaged out component of it, where we have as a spectrum extremely high earners, and then we also have extremely low earners in the township, and significant percentages of both. So it's not one where we are really kind of like everyone's around that kind of number, and you have like, what is it, the distribution arc there? Like we have kind of one where we're kind of more heavily influenced at the poles than we are in the middle. And of course, this is the breakdown of that, which is more proved out by this right here. And this to kind of tell you, it's like actually the middle is our weakest point. We're strong here. And then of course, I'm not saying weak here, but it's like more influenced on the lower end of the spectrum here, because these are only by 5K increments, and then you jump by 50K up per. So it's one where you start making leaps and bounds adjustments and saying, the reason we're here is because all this, and then this bar, like right here.
We've successfully destroyed the middle class.
There is no, and that was part of the reason we even sent out the zoning RFP for the project, was to help try to see if we can achieve some of the set standards identified by the county to address missing middle housing. That was a big part of it, because the reason we don't have these earners here is because we don't have housing for these earners here. That's a big part of it. We have big box housing, and then we have kind of the legacy existing rancher type style homes within the township, and some other products out there as well, but that's the one that is the overwhelming majority. So housing attainability, obviously everybody understands what happened in the last few years, hyperinflation, but of course that's one where everything jumped in about 2 years to make it not only, I mean, at certain rates, this is a pretty difficult number, but at current rates, at this number, you just essentially priced out a significant portion of potential homeowners that would be, basing their livelihoods living here in the township. So just wanted to do a thought exercise, assuming high density equals lower cost, because the types of products that you're building are just different, and you're going to have density plans kind of, and I'm saying it without saying it here, but this is kind of what the White Clay Point kind of represents in terms of a mixture of uses of housing. You're going to have a range of different price points. So let's say we applied that 30% of gross monthly income to be as affordable. This is kind of your AMI range that's going to be supported by this type of housing growth. So you're addressing this part right here. So that's a good thing. The problem is just how many units are you going to be able to build to actually move this number up? And that's an issue because we just don't have a lot of projects right now at scale that are providing this kind of missing middle housing component of it. We would have to do, I think it was in discussion last year during the same time frame, like 6 White Clay Points to make even the needle jump for missing middle housing too. And then of course, all of this combined still doesn't negate the fact that there really is no strategy other than having strong, attainable housing built. And that's one where that's a whole nother enterprise function of itself, where you have to work with HUD we don't even have a housing authority. We have to basically get developers to build. They're not going to build if they have high costs for infrastructure. So there's a lot of issues with that as well. So going into some other areas of economic development, the biggest one that we have in terms of just assets. So this area right here, the airport development zone. Now, a significant part of this is the actual airport. So it's mostly this kind of remaining parcels above that. And for a lot of people, I usually have this conversation because they're not aware. The entire north central part of the township is zoned as a business park. It has been for a long, long time. If you've driven through Newark Road up to the US 1 interchange, you'll notice it is very much not a business park, but that's not for lack of trying in terms of just setting the table. So the real issue is what creates business parks, but two is if not a business park, then kind of what else? So it's starting to have that conversation of if we're not market viable to have a, like if you've been up by the Great Valley Corporate Business Park Center, Vanguard and their 10,000 jobs and 500,000 square feet of commercial office spaces is probably not moving to Newark Road. So with that, should it still be zoned as a business park? This is something for questions to be answered during the zoning project update, to have the community kind of define that vision. And that's also one where, okay, but then how do we zone it to get something that we can get? And what does that mean? Those are the kinds of conversations that will be had out during that process. But that's not to say that the origination for having these kind of two co-located together was that this would help achieve this. So they're kind of seen as an aligned use there. I think there's principal kind of some correlation there. I think the execution of it is a bit misunderstood because at scale, no one's really building scaled commercial office speculative sites anymore. That's actually losing venture. There's a significant amount of commercial office vacancies across the board. We're already competing with other markets that have better corporate tax structures than Pennsylvania. So we're competing with those. And of course, like I said, we're right next door to all these localities. They're more likely to do business around there because they have sizable workforce. They have mass transit, all those other things that they would have less of here if they were to do it here. But it's not to say that we can't get something done up here. It's just what and how. So if no one's ever seen this before, this is just a version of the airport master plan. And so part of that kind of shows these areas. That's why I want to show these kind of parts. This is kind of the setup space that's listed as a developable property up by the airport. And of course, it's part of the ADZ. And these are the permitted build out within the ADZ. Now, a lot of this is influenced by the fact that the airport property of itself is built in an area that has to be, I'll call it amenable to having FAA restrictive policy kind of enacted upon it. So you can't build like a 10-story skyscraper right there up in the ADZ area up by the airport, but you can build some other things. But also it's just looking at these. This is another one I would like to have the zoning project look at and say, is this the same summary understanding of land use functions for the ADZ? Can this be looked at as well to basically have those kind of merged together in a more, I'll call it aligned functionality between the two, if that makes sense. You look like you're gonna ask a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the southernmost green checkered board is no longer owned by us.
That's right, yeah. We sold this to this property owner right here in a private transaction. That was, I can't remember how many years ago.
2017-ish?
2017,
Does that sound
yeah.
about right?
And I think that was just to raise temporary cash to just support, I can't remember what initiative it was at the time, but it's also one where, yep, and that's a transaction that lessened the overall viability of the airport. Granted, I think at the time that was just what they thought was the most important thing to do.
As when the planners are looking at things, I don't want them to.
Yes, yeah,
And
they're getting the most up-to-date land maps. I think I found this somewhere in a share folder. So land use, that's kind of what we're all talking about here in terms of just, you start adding up the 10,000 acres in the township, where's that land use designated for and how is it performing? So you can understand what future zoning flexibility you would like to have because you understand the current land use performance and you want to make sure that you're not oversaturating it with certain types of specific functions as well. And that's one where last year we talked about, because the biggest I'll call it narrative that was always provided to the township was how supportive agriculture was for providing economic value to the township. And it does at a certain point, but when you have a lot of it in the current construct that it is, in terms of, the overall tax abatements within that, the types of jobs associated with it. For this one, it's mostly just for the commercial, the property tax component. How much we have versus how much it actually provides, it's operating at a net deficit, if you will, in terms of the value returned to the township. And that's about a little less than 8%. And we'll go into a little bit more of that here, but that's kind of proved out here. So here you have the sum of acres. It's total value in terms of return to the township is providing 16%, but the acreage is at 26%. So it's -10, and that's fleshed out against a number I think it's coming from. I'll have to kind of parse out. I'm sorry. So that 40 is baked into the commercial usage component of that, if that makes sense. So F40 is a part of commercial use. So you won't see mushroom agriculture specifically as agriculture. It's defined as commercial by the county when it talks about property records and assessments placed against those properties. And then, of course, you have your residential component, which is overperforming 17%, but then it's one where how it was built out was so less dense that it's one where if you had to kind of hindsight being 2020, go back, would you plan the footprint? I'm going to just, would you plan to do it differently based off of understanding of the summary level of performance here? Granted, this is one where if you do it in certain types of development, like bigger houses, bigger homes, you're going to influence schools, you're going to influence, it's the costliest venture that you can do. But this isn't to say that there is a blended approach to doing it in different kind of versions of it to get the biggest return on investment. There's actually documentation out there in terms of this unit is seen as a cost positive, this type of unit is at a cost neutral, this type of unit is at a cost negative. So I just wanted to kind of quickly, because we've talked about this before, but this is just as we apply our tax rate to those assessable bases, and you can kind of get a disparity between the production of revenue out of those assessable properties. So that's one where about 22% of total general fund revenue comes from residential assessable property, and 5% of total general fund revenue comes from total assessable commercial property. And commercial property here being a split of traditional commercial, which is, like I said, your ag-related industries, your cold storage facilities, and of course, those specifically termed as F40, which is delineated like that to be mushroom agriculture as well. So you just can kind of understand, it's like if you have a lot of it and it's only producing that much, should your strategy be centered around doing more of it? So takeaways here, kind of to wrap this all up here, but we built out in a low dense manner based off a single family unit housing. And the other issue here is that was 35 years ago. So what we're seeing right now is a declining population base overall, or an increasing aging demographic. So our average demographic, average age has been increasing by about 5 years per census, if that makes sense. So in 2000, it was one age. In 2010, it got 5 years older. In 2020, it got 5 years older. Based off of what we have right now, that is likely to continue and continue and continue to where I think right now we're approaching in the average age in the township being 50-ish years old, which you start approaching retirement complexities with Pennsylvania not taxing on income for retirement. And that's one where now your EIT base is going to be working against you because that base is likely to go down, of course, if you don't grow it. And that's also that's just kind of a macro level thing where Pennsylvania is seen as like a retirement positive state to move to, which is a lot of 55 and up housing was built, and a lot of senior apartments are built in some sections of the Commonwealth. But that's why. And then of course that's just the residential component. The commercial component here, you have a lot of tax abated agricultural properties here that, if they're a significant presence, it's one where because of that, it's one where you're getting a negative value differential. And then of course, when you apply that and that in terms of effective use of land, then you add in this layer in 2008 when we implemented the open space program, and that's kind of acquiring some of these other properties. Granted, it's at no net cost, but that also means it's at no net revenue produced out of it as well. So it's just taking pieces of the board off of it in certain manners. So it's not, like I said, holistic, because open property down in the southern recesses of Landenberg, you know, that's not doing a whole lot of anything really. But if it's one where it's like right along a growth corridor, that's one where it's like, is that the most effective use for that property? And that's where those discussions need to be had when we talk about future open space acquisitions.
I just wanted to clarify between, when you say zero tax revenue,
Yeah.
if it was an easement, the property owner still retains it and
Correct.
does still pay
And so-
taxes.
Yes.
If we take it like we did with St.
The fee
Anthony's
simple
and-
purchases.
Yeah.
Yep, yep. And that's correct too. And then another one too is when you just factor in that a lot of those types of properties that we do kind of put easements on are already kind of assessed at a pretty, so you're really not seeing a whole lot of generated revenue out of them in and of itself, because they're just individual properties that might be assessed at like $100,000, which is at nothing, but it's not like market moving revenues that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think all of the ones that we've eased have already been agricultural, so there wasn't any.
Yep.
Yeah.
So just kind of a brief summary, it's hard to talk about economic development without at least addressing White Clay Point. Like I said, this isn't specifically an economic development managed project. It's more of just an existing land development potential project. And there's been a lot of summary restrictions of why it hasn't happened. And I'm just going to kind of quickly kind of go over it. So just for those who haven't been kind of up to date on it, it's still JP Morgan owned of the former Priet property there since 2018. It was always speculated to be some semblance of a mixed-use development of three components. You have your lower residential side, your commercial mixture side, and then your other residential side. I think this was always planned to be some semblance of single families and townhomes, some scant commercial pads, kind of like a big box retail kind of component. I think it was speculated as a 65,000 square foot grocer. There are some other, I think these were designated as like apartment pads, if you will. There was other one about a potential commercial complex there. And then of course, this was potentially going to be age restricted housing up there on the other side of Sharp and Route 41 there. But that's one where there was never submitted land development application specifically. And it's one where it's still kind of in this kind of continuing outward kind of function to it as well. So this is the most recent version that was delivered to the township as of September 30th, 2022. The total amount of units were somewhere around that 400-ish range on the upper end there. It's not to say that this is the plan that's going to come forward. And then commercial was about 135 gross square footage. Now, the issue here is because this was centered around the concept of a grocer, and grocers aren't market viable because number one, 65,000 square feet isn't necessarily seen as a large commercial grocer. Two, as you talk about competing areas in Delaware and other areas of the Kennet area. And then also just the density component of as well. So if you draw a 1 mile radius around the grocer, you get a density count of X that can only support like this scale of a grocer. 3 miles, 5 miles, you kind of grow those bands out. And it's one where if you can support a grocery store, you're probably not going to get the one that you think you want to get, that they think you can get. You're going to get some sub kind of version of it, like a boutique kind of style grocery concept or something like that. But definitely not those kind of premium brands that people associate with a successful town center component. Another one too, and it's funny because they call it the White Clay Point Town Center. Coming from Town Center Mecca in Northern Virginia, this is very much not a town center. It's a deconstructed strip mall. And that's one to kind of make sure people understand just what a town center really is, which is essentially everything is around a common place kind of structure where everything is around like literally like a town center where everyone goes to the middle there, kind of somewhat recreating a common space or like a Main Street type style concept, granted in a more condensed manner, not stretched out over, like a, quarter mile on a historic Main Street concept.
Straight next to them.
Main Street. So the primary constraint has and always will be cost of infrastructure improvements. The biggest one about that is sewer in terms of EDU capacity and just flow capacity. It's one where that doesn't exist. It has to be created. And of course, the cost per EDU of that is significantly higher than our local area counterparts. And it's one where it's always been an issue. The other ones are stormwater and transportation. So when you add up all of these and a developer comes in to look at that, they're going to say, when you add up all of this, we're never going to get close to be able to make that money back. And The issue isn't in the home sales because the home builder is usually one that makes the most out of developments. It's the developer, the person who comes in and actually builds the site. They're the ones whose margins are much, much closer. And they're the ones that are going to look at that and say, that's just not viable for us to do. And that's just based off of my prior experience working with developers doing scaled sites like this as a town center concept. And you'd be surprised at how much their margins are much, much tighter. Economic benefit of White Clay Point. So this was just one where we talked about earlier. If you apply kind of all the units evaluations here in terms of across the board, you're likely to see about a 600K-ish model. I went hyper conservative here, so you can check the math, but that's what was seen as the calculations for commercial, for residential, and for EIT. So goals, it's good to know not only why you should do what type of economic development you want to do and how valuable you are for it, but the why you want it as well. So, the biggest one right now is we still have $1 million plus structural deficit. We're currently leveraging interest income to plug that part of our budget. We want to be able to increase funding to fund capital, and we want to diversify our revenue base so we're not just over leveraged against, essentially, I think of it like residential taxes, because that's what we are. We have earned income from residential properties, and we have property tax from residential properties. So we want to kind of push that out in terms of other types of ratable tax revenues. So what is working well for hotel taxes? What is working well for amusement taxes? What is working well for a different type of approach to getting jobs onboarded for earned income tax, all of it across the board. Of course, if you are successful with economic development that kind of builds density along your growth corridors, you are going to get PennDOT's attention. PennDOT will help associate growth in terms of existing versus future infrastructure needs. And of course, a lot of our growth corridors are located on state-owned infrastructure. So it's very tough on the existing build out of New Garden to influence PennDOT's decision-making. And that should be proved out by the fact that we still have the worst intersection in the state, and it still has yet to be totally addressed. It's in the process of finally becoming that, but that's how difficult it is to get them to source funding towards a project. You can literally have the worst rated thing and they still will likely not do it. And that's, of course, Avondale, the same thing with their bridge right now. Like I kind of alluded to, you want to create local job opportunities by diversifying your commercial land use function. And then, of course, you want to address housing as well. You want to make sure that you're kind of checking as many boxes as you can. And that's also one where you also want to try to see if you can attract some new families in terms of long-term tenured township residents. And that's one where also we're seeing kind of net decreases or at least plateauing to decreasing forecast for Kennett Consolidated School District population as well. So those are actually going down. So the strategy is just, harness your assets, the biggest one being the airport property, activate White Clay Point. That's easier said than done because you're trying to influence something where you have very little leverage in the conversation to get it done. Because right now you're essentially trying to step in between developers and utilities, and that's a very difficult conversation where you don't have a lot of weight to be able to have that dialogue with them. But you have that conversation where you can. You want to look at probably the likely to increase infill requirement for existing agricultural properties because there is some net consolidation with agricultural industry. So our mushroom growers in and of themselves are consolidating their own organizations and their own sites, and that is leaving kind of like a haves and have-nots amongst the grower industry. It's also one where you might have a lot of boutique type style farms out there that generational turnover transition is just likely not going to happen, and then that property goes up for whatever it can be. So that's one where you can look at that in terms of adaptive reuse of existing properties. That's part of our zoning process as well. And then it's just understanding if you're going to try and be trying to attract new township tax base, what type of tax base should you attract? That seems like a weird limerick or something like that, but this has always been part of the strategy. It's to attract high-paying tech jobs. I think is like completely as scripted out of our comp plan. And these are types of I'll call them high-tech paying industries that are growth industries right now. And I'll call it like the modern economy, but in today's economy as well. So a lot of interest and investment into expanding for technology, pharmaceutical, health service, as well as modern research and development types of job functions. Those are broad brush categories. There's a lot of companies that kind of fall into that. So it's figuring out which one of these wants to do business in Southeast Pennsylvania. Kind of quickly go over infrastructure because I think we've harped on this enough, but you can't talk about funding for infrastructure until you start talking about what you're already funding in terms of its gravity on the net impact to your general fund expenditures and kind of what's remaining, which is about 243K per year that we transfer into our capital reserve position right now, which is about 3% of all expenditures. So if you apply that out to an average household, this is just from property taxes, not income tax, but that means per property owner, they're paying about $15 per year for infrastructure. So it's not a big number. And of course, it's based off of this tax table right here as well. So the biggest part that we have in terms of our infrastructure is the paving program. I like to just kind of highlight people what the paving program means really, but think of it just as a formulaic approach to what we're trying to get to is a 20-year replacement cycle for the linear miles of roadway in the township, which means if you do 3 miles a year, it equates to currently today's cost about 1.5 to 1.7 million annually. Of course, those costs vary in terms of just the amount of, I'll call it depth you have to go down to re-improve the road. So with that, we source funding for this from 3 sources, interest income, capital fund cash, and liquid fuels. Liquid fuels we get from the state. It's actually on its way down and probably likely to continue to trend downward, and that's because of just people adopting hybrid and battery-powered vehicles. Not as much money coming from gas taxes, which was what the liquid fuels tax is sourced from. So that's going to be a waning asset as well. So the big takeaway in this is all 3 of those are non-sustainable revenues because if you're not replenishing your capital, it's a non-sustainable revenue. And then, of course, like I said before, the primary method that we have to improve those revenues, really, when you talk about building back fund balance, is transferring more money into it, which comes from either tax-based growth or tax rate growth. So this is kind of an overview of the paving program, and I'll kind of click down through it. But essentially, people, let's say people like interested residents usually will inquire about why isn't my road being paved? And I'll say it depends on your ranking within the overall matrix of all roads. So we don't have an ad hoc approach to this. Everything is formulaic based off of a graded score that's provided through our robotics program, which is provided by Pannoni Engineering, and they do this on a biannual basis. I think we're subject to do it. We just wrapped up paving in early September or mid-September, and they essentially give us a rated score based off of the severity of the conditions of that road. So what they'll do is they'll drive over the road and they take about 1 million pictures, and they just kind of look at a cross section and go, there's a lot of divots here. You know, that's a bad one. And they'll kind of do that again. And then they'll take the average of that section, lump it up together. So it's not just one part of that roadway section. It's all the average graded metrics that roll up that say that road as a net is a 1.57 out of 5. So the lighter to yellow to red, the worse it is. And the good news is I mean, there's a lot of roads. And I think it's just because was it beauty is in the eye of the beholder kind of thing. The score isn't likely to show as much severity as you might see in terms of just, there might be some cracks on the road, but overall it's in kind of quote unquote a drivable condition. So that's kind of why you see more green there, and people will say, well, that's not what I see every single day. It's just kind of how that scoring goes. But we don't really look at it as, hey, green, we're good, we don't have to fund paving. We look at it as what's the actual score of it, and then just making sure to keep it as high as possible. Another one is the approach to it not being driven by hotspots in terms of how that's done. So let's say, because this came from Hartfield when their road condition analysis request came through and was briefed to them, if you might have a road here that's 47th out of 167. If we have a paving program year where we do significant amount of paving projects, in theory, you should jump up a little bit. But if we only do like 5 roads a year, that means you're going to be 6 years out from your road getting paved. That's what it means. This is a long-term plan that we have approach to as well. So it's kind of like steering the Titanic. It takes time. And we're only recently funding it. And this is what I show people. So historically, we really only used our liquid fuels tax to do paving. Its problem is you're not even coming close to that 3 mile per year metric when you do only about $400,000 a year of liquid fuels tax provided expenditures on it. So we created the sewer sale investment fund. It created all that interest. And now we're able to do a lot of big projects. And so the real goal was, okay, let's start doing the most critical big projects. that was Star Road, that was Pemberton, that was Hillendale Road. I think Scarlet, there's a couple other kind of key ones out there. I'm pretty sure people can come in and say that one, you're missing that one, you're missing that one as well. But we're just trying to do the most with what we have based off of a surplus interest income strategy that is going down. But the good news is because of this jump, we've increased our paving expenditures by 70% since 2014. Really, I would say we've increased it by a significant amount since 2021. So we've only recently increased our funding towards it. And then, of course, we're talking about the unsustainability of that. So we're going to push it as far as we can have a sourced revenue plan until strategy dictates otherwise. And that can be influenced by the public, the board sentiment, staff recommendations. There's a lot of things that can change that pivot. Stormwater, that's another one where just understanding what it actually means. So stormwater as a function of the township's compliance is primarily driven through PADEP mandates. You adopt an MS4 program, which is essentially this is your monitoring program to address, we'll call it the best practice management that the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection imparts upon you. So in this case, in the current installment, we have to source projects that lower sediment that is going into all of our streams. And that net sediment reduction is what's based off of our net impervious, I'll call it, impact on the area. So for us, I think of the 2020 MS4 program that was imparted to New Garden Township assessed us about 330,000 net pounds of sediment reduction requirements, which we currently have moving forward with the project that we're implementing at the Smedley Preserve Loch Naren Golf Course. So that's good. Even having a project and having it be funded is just, that's the other part of it. If you don't have that and you just recently did that, that number is going to be astronomically higher. But that's just PADEP requirements. Then you just have infrastructure, which is a whole nother function of it. That's asset management and that's operational management. Asset management is that culvert's going to fail. You know, that system area with those pipes underneath the ground are failing, or in this case, some of them are just non-existent anymore. They've been completely corroded out. And their other one is operational management, just having a service team go out there, service inlets, do routine repairs and maintenance and functions on this. So that's more cost of labor and cost of commodities to do that. So I consider this to be an entire stormwater program. And it's, if you are in a high area with not a lot of rivers, you know, you might not have a lot of stormwater obligations. You don't have a lot of hardscape or infrastructure. It's not, but we as a township, we are in a very wet area. We have a lot of boundary lines that have significant riparian branches through them. I think it's the western branch of the Red Clay Creek and the eastern branch of the White Clay Creek, as well as a bunch of tributaries. Another one too is we have a kind of high ground to low ground aspect to it. We're very much crested in the middle. We do have some pools and valleys, which only compound the situation. Like Tough Kenneman obviously is subject to prone because you have these floodplain areas that are right next door. And then we have this infrastructure here that during a significant rain event sheets off. And usually when that happens with a high amount of flow of water, it just picks up the infrastructure and carries it to where it's ultimately going to go. And I have some pictures of that as well. So normally, nationally, the adopted best practice is you have to enact a stormwater management fee. This is like having a sewer utility, a water utility, an electric utility. It's a stormwater utility, if you will. Now, that's one where normally that revenue is sourced through a portion of your impervious coverage of your property, more so than what it's currently being done in Pennsylvania, which is localities have it. It's just part of their assessable value of their property. And that's one where that's probably not the best because you have a high cost property. Doesn't mean you should pay more for stormwater. It should be based off of how much concrete you have on your property. The part of that is that's actually being at the Attorney General level for Pennsylvania because of an issue between Westchester Borough and Westchester University, where Westchester University fought back on being enacted a stormwater tax based off of impervious coverage. So that's actually keeping us from enacting that type of function if we were to do it. So these are just some pictures of locations that I've lived in personally that have stormwater things. I have stood near this roadway on Scenic Highway Drive in Pensacola, Florida. This is a section of a city that was essentially drenched by about 26 inches of rain in about a 2-mile area in about 12 hours. And so essentially you just turn the hose on and just flooded an area. And these were relatively brand new roads, and it just does what it's going to do. Another one, if you've ever been to Ellicott City, Maryland, I have family that lives in this area. It happened twice in like 3 years. And it's one where they built a bunch of impervious build out up at the top of the hill outside of the old historic area. And then, of course, it all flows down into, I think it's the Patapsco branch area there and just outside of Ellicott City, where they have that bridge train trestle area, and it just carries everything with it. And if you're not familiar with these two, of course, we have, obviously in the Chad's Ford area, right along one. There's more of a pooling function, if you will, a lack of ability to drain, but all of these represent scaled stormwater issues, and I already alluded to it. Our biggest risk right now is just we are in an area where it's ripe for increasing amount of magnitude of significant rain events, and our infrastructure in of itself not being fit to be able to handle it. So at some point, this is going to come to a head, and it's just when. And how actively are you doing to try to address your capital needs to be able to say, at least we're putting modern technology against it rather than hoping this 50-year-old legacy infrastructure can handle a 300-year to 1,000-year type style flood event in the area. So we do have some stormwater projects, albeit this is the very lightest amount of projects that we can possibly do. These were always discussed in our updated plans here for capital improvement plans. And it's one where you can see if you're going to do essentially just a culvert project, you're talking upwards of $250,000 to $500,000 just for one culvert. It depended upon the scale and magnitude of that culvert, as well as just if you're going to do an infrastructure improvement, let's say the entire village of Tough-Kenneman, it ranges in terms of impact. So it's like the lightest impact option, which I don't think actually really solves the issue, versus the complete replacement. Those are significantly scaled projects. But it's also good to know because the replacement of stormwater infrastructure in Tough-Kenneman, much like White Clay Point for sewer, is a restriction on getting developer interest to actually revitalize Tough-Kenneman. So it's one of those things where until you fix these issues, you're likely not going to see turnover of those areas in terms of just revitalization for what we would hope to achieve through rezoning and those types of influences that we can do. And of course, we talked about the stormwater fee component of it. All right, transportation. This one's pretty much cut and dry in terms of just infrastructure projects that we have for active transportation projects. Most of the ones that we have at scale right now are PennDOT related projects because they're on PennDOT arteries. We've already talked about this in prior public meetings, but it is good to note that these are being at least heightened to a level of design and engineering where it's moving forward towards construction more so than just in theory types of like studies and stuff that had been done prior to these projects moving forward. We still have this Main Street sidewalk project as well, and we're wrapping up right-of-way easement captures as we speak, and that project is still subject to that DVRPC funded, it's essentially federal funding to commission that sidewalk project, which is just a widening of the existing Main Street sidewalk on the southern end of Main Street, with I think one pedestrian crossing to the, I forgot the name of the church, kind of at the midpoint that's right there in Tough-Kenneman. So other things that we're doing right now is, of course, our planning studies, and that's dictated by not only your land use assumption report from your Act 209, but your zoning as well. We're having those two projects talk to each other. And the goal, of course, is to get a sense of understanding of how much our zoning impacts density for future development. And then with that, what is needed to be in terms of the total, I'll call them counts incurred by those developments being implemented. And of course, that generates Act 209 traffic fees that help us support as revenue towards transportation projects. That's that kind of like holistic enterprise function for transportation. Good one here. So we can stop there real quick, just kind of breaking up a little bit. The public safety component going into is obviously about police and fire, but any questions to date on economic development, infrastructure, and issues? Anybody? All right. Oh, no, yeah, we can if you want to, if that's easier, but. Really, the last part of this is the quickest part too. It's those other ones that are more complex, because I think these ones are a little bit more scripted for what people know. So I can go through these real quick if you want to hold it to the end still. Sure. So I like to put this on a slide for people who have never kind of dove into how our public safety organizations are established. But this is just kind of a summary overview of those different organizations. Chester County, we're very much a stakeholder at the table in terms of Southern Chester County Regional Police. We're an established stakeholder that participates in a commission where we have an expenditure split between us and West Grove with an intermunicipal agreement for services to Avondale Borough. Fire company, very much different. We don't have a codified structure that says, other than just a yearly kind of, you are our dedicated fire company. So they are de facto our fire company, but it's not through some sort of established commission overseeing them as an entity that has township officials serving on it, if that makes sense. There are certain components of it, like we do have representation for the ALS component of for Southern Chester County EMS, but of course that's one component of the entire fire EMS. And then the biggest thing is just how much we fund these in and of itself, which I think we've already hit on. It's about 80% per organization of township municipal funding for their revenues. So police, if you haven't kind of understood the history of it, it was regionalized in 2016. It had kind of incremental cost increases over that time frame from establishing a regional police to getting it accredited to a level of accreditation. And then, of course, just the churn of continuous collective bargaining agreements that are viable through the union structure for polices in Pennsylvania. This is kind of the driving increase of expenditures over time for supporting a police department. This is no different than any other police department organization in Pennsylvania. This is just how we execute ours. The biggest part of regionalization too wasn't necessarily to cut costs, it was to slow the rate of increases over time. So when you share that relationship, quote unquote, wholesaling, that's the outcome there. So you will see an increase, and this is of course what we've seen because these are our actuals for police funding. It's one where it's like, okay, you can see this kind of going up between 1.6 up to above 2.6 if we're going out to 2028. But it's also one, if you were to take that regional function out here, this is likely to be a much steeper slope here. So we actually are able to kind of slant it down a little bit. But it's one where we formed it, we had some interim CBAs, and of course our current CBA, which was established for FY24 to 27, keeps us at about a consistent growth over the next 4 years of about $286,000. That's the township's contribution to the level of municipal funding over time. So that's what I would consider to be, for the level of service you're getting from the police, a very significant, I won't call it deal, but it's a tremendous value to the locality for having that level of service, having a traffic safety division, having a fully accredited agency, and then having the level of forensic kind of components to it, the detectives components to it. It's a full service entity. But with that, there are restrictions of regionalization, because we always talk about regionalization. So we look on the map. So everything with a color attached to it, not blue, excuse me, everything with a different than color blue thing, these are areas in Southern Chester County that have a police department. There's a lot more blue than there are those identified that have it. So when we talked about regionalization, you're really only talking about a local footprint of people right by you that either A, do we merge this thing or do we not? Because the likelihood of regionalization, quote unquote, amongst participating municipalities is much higher. Regionalization by somebody who doesn't pay for police, who then has to start paying for police, that is a canyon that you have to jump over, because that is a huge jump based off of the scale of funding requirements it means to fund police. And these are also localities that very much have we don't need this service because our calls don't justify it. So the likelihood to partner with any of these other surrounding localities is very, very low. So you're already kind of restricted in terms of outcomes, if you will. And that's, of course, these areas are all serviced by state police, and state police don't charge. So really, in this case, state police would have to start charging in order to kind of influence anybody. I just don't know when or well that would ever, excuse me, when that will ever be. So another component, I think this came up last year's discussion about, hey, areas around us, because you're going back to this, all these other areas have very low tax rates. And I said, you know what, you're right. And the biggest reason that is police, but I didn't have the objective information at the time, and I wish I had, because the objective information is very clear. These are your haves in terms of have police. These are your have-nots in terms of have-not police. And of course, the average millage rate of those localities being significantly lower, of about 5 mils. This is the entire Southern Chester County region in and of itself. And of course, you have differences in population, whether or not they have earned income tax or not. So another way to look at this was, well, when you kind of get below a certain population density, you're probably going to have a low. So I just wanted to kind of eliminate some of the noise. So I wanted to look at those that have not significant, but like higher population counts. So those like 5,000 and above communities that also have EIT, because EIT is a revenue source that lessens the influence on your tax rate. You have EIT, so you don't have high property taxes. And of those, the average EIT of these communities, assuming tax rate was about 0.2. So that's one where if you don't have police versus you do have police, I would compare these localities more to these localities in of itself. So it just grows the disparity between funding levels for it or funding levels for not having it, excuse me. So with that, I kind of did a thought exercise. So obviously our counterparts just to the west, northwest of us is London Grove. Their all-in municipal budget in terms of expenditures for proof for 24 was about 6.2 million. That's without police. If we took our expenditure level for 24, 7.7, and we removed police from our funding levels, it would lower us to about 5.3. So we're actually spending less than London Grove Township on our remaining services. So that just kind of gives you that we're not just errantly funding certain areas that we shouldn't be funding. We're saving and we're assuming we're structuring every dollar accordingly to a compliance-driven area, and that's the value that you're getting. So this isn't to say that we shouldn't have a police. It's just to say this is a tremendous value that we're providing in terms of scaled services at the lowest possible cost. But that's also not to say that as growth occurs in Southern Chester County, I think you've saying about 140 to 150,000 people in the next 20 some odd years in the entire county. A certain component of that's going to be along Route 41. Let's say that's like 30 to 40,000 people, just a percentage of that one. At some point, if this continues in place, and I'm for people not looking at me in person here, I'm pointing at the localities that don't support police, that disparity is going to grow. It's going to come to an inflection point, and the only reason I'm saying that is because at some point, people are going to be kind of disgruntled by the fact that our police, just by traversing their departments, go through other boroughs and municipalities, so they're getting, just by proximity, the convenience of not paying for police that patrol their areas. And that's one where how much are we as a township going to be willing to just essentially subsidize the cost for their public safety. That's going to be proofed out in school resource officers for school districts that don't have police departments, you name it, across the board, but it's going to stress the system at some point. And so that's one where, I mean, obviously I'm not a policy maker in terms of just my, board sentiment and everything, but this would be something to watch essentially.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of Avondale Fire Company, we already talked about how kind of the municipal revenues towards them is the biggest portion of their revenues, and that we don't really have a ratified agreement, so we have to work collaboratively with Avondale Fire Company, if you will. If as a historian dating back to 2021, so obviously not too far ago, they did have London Grove as a participant in terms of supporting Avondale Fire Company. That agreement was nullified, and London Grove now works with West Grove. But that was a revenue loss. And with that, when we had that revenue loss, we're a single station capacity. So in terms of driving costs for services, having a response that has to come from one station and it's the entire response, that just drives up the cost of that function of itself. And of course, you're talking about other factors here where EMS billing revenue recovery performance nationally is going down. That's just EMS as an enterprise. The insurance complexities in terms of how much revenue you're getting back for your billing recovery for EMS services is nationally going down and trending continue to go down. It's getting harder and harder to be recouped for services. So where is that revenue coming now from? It's coming from rate or to be funding service level increases that you normally didn't have to fund. Continued increase of regional salaries and benefits for fire and EMS personnel. It's part of it is in terms of if you have cost employees. Another one is you no longer have full volunteer force. And the other one too is the volunteer force is dwindling because you're not getting continued interest in serving as a volunteer. So you're just not able to replace people anymore. And so what you have to do is it's either A, you have to reduce response and reduce service, or B, you have to hire full-time people, and that's a cost increase in of itself. And then for us, because we're a fire station surrounded by other fire stations that are independently controlled by different organizations, you're competing with them in a very local area. Cost for equipment is extremely high. I think the cost for a new ladder truck is about what, a little over $2 million. The cost for a new pumper truck is about $1 million. Ambulance about $500,000. And of course, it takes about can't remember how many months in advance, 2 years almost in advance to order those pieces of equipment. It's a very long, arduous, costly process to just, it's one thing when you're paying for a new service truck for a public works department. It's a different thing when that service truck goes from being about $50,000 to over $500,000 at the minimum. And then, of course, if you're trying to get full-time employees and you leverage a grant, let's say, because this is giving you federal money to, or state money to fund that position, those grants aren't into perpetuity. They essentially fall off at some point. If you're not able to increase revenues from other sources other than municipal funding, you're going to be left on the tab to continue to have to fund those positions. So that's just kind of a way of saying the grant is great, but it also increases the funding level position requirements in future years because there is no revenue replacement coming in to support that position. But it's also one where you need that position because you need that body. And then, of course, the last 5 years, the funding factors, all of this kind of combined has led to about 120% increase for fire and EMS services. Now, a big part of that jump can be baked in the fact that historically, the township didn't really support funding level requirements for fire and EMS. We just didn't fund it the level. So municipal requests were one thing, municipal contributions were another. So there was a bit of right sizing. So I think over time, this would have been more of a linear rather than a cost bump increase, but it's also one where is it going to go? And that's one where you still don't really have an understanding because at the end of the day, all of these factors aren't going away. You know, so you can, both things can be true. You can have historically underfunded it, but also have an increased cost for services down the road that's only exponentially going up. So that's where our flat funding, loss of London Grove, and of course the 120% increase there. The one component of this in terms of ALS services, so Southern Chester Canine EMS, and their ability to provide medic level service, paramedics, excuse me, it's gone up very little, and that's just because it's part of a 17 regional participation model. So it's the ultimate example of like a wholesale service relationship, if you will. Territory has a big thing to do with it. So we're here in the middle, wedged between two larger station regions, if you will. So of course, regionalization, and of course, that's obviously still to continue the buzzword there, but it's just one where regionalization sounds great, but then you look at it and go, well, we really only kind of have two options. So that's one where you're looking at a partner to your west or a partner to your east, and then understanding the limitations of what these models represent also compounds the issue. And that's kind of the kind of constraint there as well. So these are just the summary level of constraints per organizational service here based off of the prior slides, but it's one where we're having conversations. It's not like we're just talking about it in these public dialogues. We're actually sitting down with our public service providers and just trying to come up with a solution, because it's not just us talking about this. It's Kennet talking about this, it's Kennet Borough talking about this, it's Oxford Borough talking about this. That's just specifically for police. Those same localities are having the exact same fire and EMS one. And it's also to understand that the county isn't supporting this at all whatsoever. So we don't have this higher level entity that's going to be committed to funding it either. So what do you do? Because it's not like the need is ever going to go away. For organizational excellence, I can kind of roll through this because it's been based off of prior versions, but essentially it's just understanding that the organization is justified based off of what we have in terms of our commitment to providing services for it. So with that, you know, this is how kind of everything aggregates up in terms of why we need it. And it's based off, like I said, our land use function and what we have. Historically, it's been one where this was a much smaller organizational chart. I don't think that was by anything other than the fact that they just didn't think they should be funding it at a higher level. But it was never because we just didn't have the service need. We just actively didn't support funding levels for service requirements. And the biggest part was this right here. So we had adopted a municipal, not adopted, we had to abide by a municipal planning code that we weren't in compliance with. We had a property maintenance code that we weren't in compliance with. We were actively not even supporting an international fire code, and of course we didn't do rental inspections. So we just weren't interested in doing the required level of service commensurate of, as township of our size, of the land development function. That was something that we improved because we had to. Because we had buildings being built without permits, we had a sizable amount of issues gone unmitigated for property maintenance violations across the board. This was just a summary of those kind of net increases that mostly occurred for FTE increases over the course of the last 4 years and what that meant to the township in terms of just this is what we needed to do to right-size the organization to get it to the minimum standard level. Now, part of the FY25 capital plan that you'll see in terms of the next few years is to do finally an organizational staffing analysis, just how many headcount should we actually have to fund our level of services. It's one where it's likely to show more of a still missing piece of the puzzle, more so than kind of being oversaturated with FTE, but we'll wait for that analysis to show us. And then, of course, when you have an organization set up, you want to keep it in terms of a sustainable model that's based off of retention of existing subject matter experts that you hired for a reason. You want to keep them. So retention more so than dealing with attrition. You'd rather proactively prevent that with reasons for retaining employees. So a big part of that is just keeping up with a competitive market viable approach for funding positions. And then, of course, supplementing that with a lot of the other things that you can do to make it a holistic workplace. So technology improvements, enhancing the workplace conditions, benefits in terms of not just, insurance kind of related benefits, but paid time off policies, other things that we've done as a township to improve the conditions here, because retention of existing employees is one where if we lose employee today, even though we did have increased employee counts, it's still one where we're still singular departments in certain instances. So if one person leaves, we're going to be without that position for a sizable amount of time. For community services, a lot of people think of this as kind of what kind of programs and events you're doing, and that might be true, but another one is just as a governmental entity, what departmental functions are you not providing? So these are just examples of other kind of local, regional services that, we're not obligated to provide as a township, but we do liaison and support, at least in terms of coordination of information with these functions. But it's not one that we're really even close to being able to, absorb and provide as a township. Not even allowed by the second-class township code to provide it. But there is a function that is kind of currently underfunded that's still out there, and that's emergency management. And that's one where right now we have one centralized county emergency management function. The issue with that is they are a singular entity with a light staff that has to service the entire Chester County region. And so it's one where they're obviously saturated in any emergency event with dealing with not just their ability to get communications out there, get their people on scene, but it's like where on scene. Because let's say a big storm event comes through, it's not just going to hit Newgard, it's going to hit the entire broad brush of Chester County. So where do you go? And of course, that's another one where they have to liaison with us because they don't have first responders. So if you have a county emergency management function, but you don't have a kind of quote unquote army to spool up to support emergency management responses, what are you really? So you need somebody locally that says, this is how, stepping forward, New Garden Township is affecting the situation. And right now we don't have that function, well, at least historically we didn't have that function, I'll call it adequately staffed and sourced with somebody who is a committed departmental staffer. That's what we ended up doing in the FY24 budget. I mean, we went from essentially a non-existent position to a part-time position, but it's still one where we're stressing that position because that person's dual-hatted between the fire marshal and emergency management. They're more focused right now, time-wise, on fire marshal functions because it's the most day-to-day operational component of their job. But it's also one where emergency management is not only a full-time position justified, but it's probably multiple positions dependent upon the size of the locality. And it's always one where it's always focused on those proactive implementation, I'll call them functions that you can do, establishing your operating procedures, making sure you're trained to it. This is probably the military component to be coming out here, but proper planning prior prevents X, Y, and Z. So it's one where you want to make sure that you have a well-organized and defined trained process that everybody understands, because the last thing you want to do is be figuring out after things happen. That's the worst time to do it. Because the first thing to break down in any emergency is communication. And if nobody understands what they should be doing without communication, it's going to be a disorganized mess. And that's not theoretical. That's based off of just the last 12 months worth of activities when we're trying to coordinate communications between first responders. Everybody kind of does their own thing and they do it well, but there's no sense of cooperation when it comes to reporting and getting that information up to the county. So that's that function that person serves here. So of course, the last 12 months, these are just the ones that I can think of off the top of my head in terms of documented kind of severity to it, where we had a significant amount of local damage. And that's one where, we did our best to structure the information into those routine damage assessment forms to be able to submit for FEMA reimbursements. Shocker, none of them came to fruition because there was no scaled funding provided for the ones that hit the township the worst. I think this most recent one that came through associated with Debbie, Hurricane Debbie, did get disaster declared by the state. The problem was we didn't have the damage incurred to be able to submit for funding. So we got impacted the least for that one. And yet an inline storm event came through and like devastated the entire area, shut down town hall for like 3 to 4 days. And that's just kind of where we're at. We're dependent upon the state as well. But it's not for the lack of trying. And then another one too is just when we're talking about emergency operation management, it's also emergency operation capacity. So during the 3-day power outage, this building was essentially a rudderless ship. It was not powered. Our generator doesn't work. For those who have ever said, it only powers the emergency backup lights. And then maybe the fire panel if we can get full power to it. That's because we have an undercapacitized generator. It's in the FY25 capital plan to replace it. But it's also one where in and of itself, in an emergency, what is the purpose of this building as like a operating component of it? Because it is the largest public building in the entire region. So let's put it to good use. Because currently, right now, we're talking about heating centers, cooling centers, mass casualty response centers, anything like that. Other than schools, there's really, and schools aren't the dedicated asset to structure an emergency management response because that's not their function. In fact, if something happens in the middle of the summer, schools aren't in session, no one's there. It's one where the usually national adopted best practice standard is the locality adopts that response capacity. And so that would be one where we would want to look at possibly how we could harness this building as an asset for those moments in time, because I think the only dedicated response centers are only open part-time during the day, not on weekends sometimes, and they're like very small scale facilities. I think they're called like the garages, and one's in Avondale Borough and one's in West Grove, and they're nowhere near the capacity needs for the population count in this region. I think we can quickly go over open space. So this is one where just defining the types of easement as well as the cost of open space maintenance. We had talked about these in prior versions, and we're doing everything to make sure that we shift the burden out of the general fund into the open space fund in terms of a portion of the cost share to fund open space maintenance on the open space fund. So we're actively doing that, and that's made possible by, we'll go to it here in a second here, the Act 32 code. But this is one where just the open space program, if people weren't aware, it's all based off of our open space map, if you will, of just identifiable properties within the township that have been seen as a use of either lands or trails to support not just open space envisioned for having open space properties, but also access to open space properties to implement trails to enact the township greenways and trails program as well. So there's kind of a dual purpose to it. But that's, of course, we're about halfway through, like a little bit more than halfway through, but we still have more to look at in terms of future acquisitions. So it's one where it's still moving forward as a function. This kind of reviews the Open Space Act 32, Section 4 about use of revenues, and then how we're using it as a township. Like I said, we're going to be shifting more towards the accumulated fund balance because right now our open space fund balance, 25%, is a significantly higher amount of money to be able to portion out, because we not only have to fund open space maintenance, but we have to fund those projects as well. And that's the best way to kind of increase the bandwidth to kind of get things through. I think we already alluded to New Garden Flying Field in terms of its airport development zone viability, but another one that we got in terms of just public interest when we're talking about the airport during budgeting is just what does this mean in terms of the taxpayer and just what the property in and of itself is in terms of what the airport is and how it's been built out over time and kind of where that revenue comes from and what does that mean for the locked-in component of providing that service. And that's one where it comes from the origination of it. And thank you for correcting me. I had it on the side here. 2007 was when we purchased it. It was kind of a split between state and township funds to secure it. The grants kind of is set apart some existing restrictions on using the property to support, I'll call it aviation standard uses, and the FAA supplies all that information. But with that, because we met that compliant nature of it, we were able to access a significant amount of federal and state level money to do a significant amount of improvements to the property just to make it a more viable airport. So in totality, over the course of the last decade plus, we've gotten about $13+ million in federal funding, and we've only spent about $800K just to get that airport into the condition it's in, and we're continuing to use that strategy. Now, with that, it's also saying that because this amount of federal money has been spent into the airport, it's not like you can reverse that. You would have to repatriate all of those dollars back to where they came from if you're ever to try to move on from it serving as an airport to something else. So it locks us into that use. But it's not saying that we can't support the viability of the airport, because right now, because of the services we provide, which it's not just a great runway environment experience for the size of aircraft fit for our area, but it's also the types of services we provide at the school. The revenues in all of this support the airport. So it is an enterprise fund, a restricted enterprise fund. So the airport master plan, I already alluded to this, but there is a component of it when you talk about, well, if it's by the airport, can this area be built out to support airport functions? And so what are those airport related industries? Because we talk about market viable industries, and the township right now has scaled interest from potential future agricultural functions because we already have it here. So everyone, like I said, that clustering effect. Well, is there a scaled function that can go in from an aviation component of it just to be next to an airport? You've seen it with the Piasecki plant up by Southern Chester County Regional Airport. Aviation businesses like to be around an airport. It's just kind of, like I said, that clustering effect. So can our airport host a clustered aviation business footprint in and of itself? And that's something that we're going to try to look at, because the other part is would an increase of that aviation interest justify making improvements to the site in of itself? Would we need to expand the runway to support larger level aircraft going in to support that industry that it's going to go on? Do we need to upgrade? And for those unfamiliar with the type of gas, you know, it's like if you had, you know, leaded and unleaded or whatever it would be, kind of, you know, grade 87, 89, then you have diesel. If you didn't have a diesel in your gas station pumps, you're not getting that traffic. So right now, we don't have Jet A1. That's like larger grade, commercial grade traffic, military grade as well. Of course, obviously facility site expansion needs as well, larger hangars, larger terminal, larger everything. But with that, are there other non-aviation specific uses that would just want to be around the airport? So if you've ever been around an airport, municipally owned or whatever it is owned, they tend to have kind of big box footprints around them, just because it's kind of a natural zoning component where you want to put those types of industries and uses around the airport facility, mostly because a lot of it is around packaging and servicing needs in terms of logistics. But that's not to say that we can't possibly look at that, granted at a smaller scale. So something like that. Like I think this is actually from Chester County Airport as well. So the last but not least here, and I'll kind of gloss over it, but it's not to say that it's not totally important, but it's one where we do have a sustainability program that's already been enacted here within the township. We are one of, I think, 6 listed Chester County entities that actually have some semblance of a defined DCED sustainable certification. And that's one where that actually allows us to harness for certain types of grants with DCED in of itself. And that's the value of it right now. There are some other opportunities if the township wanted to pursue more green infrastructure. It's just one where you have to do the understanding of public sentiment to implement and how it would be used. Because there's one where the expectation would be, I want to come up here and I want to charge my vehicle for free. And that's one where most services right now, if they're coming in as a complete no-cost kind of model too, and they're not subsidized, they charge for that service. So that's kind of an expectation. So we would have to understand what model do we want, and then where do we want it as well. And of course, enacting the policies to make sure that everything is done at a level of, you know, this is how it's not abused. This is how you kind of make sure that it is adequately sourced for the vendor being obligated to do all the replacement of the infrastructure. So it's not on you to replace it, all that kind of stuff. But really, it's just at the end of the day, what is the value add for this as a township, and really thinking about that. So really kind of the takeaway of a SWOT-esque analysis of it. I've already been talking about it throughout the entirety of the brief here, but really we're talking about strengths. These are our net strengths. These aren't all of them, but kind of the summary level, high level assets that we have. These are our weaknesses. It's funny when I say the second class township tax code is a weakness, it is. It's one where we don't really have anything to manipulate the rate increase other than property taxes. So it's not like we can increase income taxes. It's not like we have the ability to enact new taxes because we are not that type of township. I think you have to adopt a home rule version of government. And then it's also one where you have to be a certain type of township to even have the ability to do that. So we would have to bump up to a first-class township, which is a whole nother set of kind of complexities to go into it as well. And of course, you have to be dense enough to be a first-class township. So there's a lot of restrictions to get to there. Opportunities, talked about most of it being our assets in terms of most things associated with economic development. And then threats, one is it's inherent to any kind of active land development application. You're going to have a level of NIMBYism. We don't want that. You usually can try to combat that as much as possible with information about what it actually is. You're still not going to get rid of all of that, but you're still going to be able to at least get a certain portion of the community bought into the vision. Another one is just a lot of things that are kind of beyond our control, macroeconomic impacts as well. You know, we aren't able to control the weather, but it's something that's always a risk to us as well. And then priorities, activate development. I'll just read the bold points here: address infrastructure, regionalized services, and address organizational community service weaknesses. Those are kind of the high level takeaways. What I would say for the next few years, this is where we need to kind of hone in on. In terms of key risk with that, like we already alluded to it, things beyond our control, inability to activate growth, you know, because there's only a certain amount of leverage that you have in development, and because it's a second-class township in Pennsylvania, that leverage is very little. Unsuccessful ability to regionalize just based off of those hard constraints that we already talked about for each type of service, as well as infrastructure, emergency infrastructure expenditures. If you do have an issue, you know, you'll probably get emergency funding, but that's not free. Emergency funding just gets you by. It comes at a long-term, and that's in the form of repayments for that emergency infrastructure as well. It's not subsidized. So that's one where, you know, the money will come from somewhere, but it won't necessarily mean that you got it done just because a big event hit you. So with that, questions, and I tried to get it at, I estimated 2 hours, and I'm at 2 hours and 10 minutes. So there you go. So I don't know if there's any questions. I know from you, Jeff. Sure. This is the night is young for a board meeting here, so this is one where you're subject, at least if you want to ask something, but it's not even for your own edification. This is being recorded so we can present these because someone else out there who might not be either viewing now or viewing later might have the same question. And here, I'll actually give you a microphone so you don't. Just.
So thank you for going through this, very comprehensive presentation. I really like the transparency that you brought to this. Will this be available online? Can we see
Yes.
a copy of this?
Yep.
Okay.
So we're going to put this all bucketed within our annual budget. We're going to realign how we structure budget information to include audit information and this. And so you'll see all of these brief presentations as well as this is being recorded. So you'll be able to go back and view this online as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'll just kind of like start from the top
Sure.
because I was taking notes as we went along. You began with financial management and underscored the board's real importance that they're placing on sound finance, and I think that's fantastic. You reviewed a number of the revenue increasing initiatives and how that was going to impact the budget over time, but I don't recall seeing anything related to cost-cutting initiatives and how that's going.
Yeah. So one cost-cutting initiative we did right off the bat and we're continuing to try to do is pull park level funding for open space out of the general fund and moving that to the open space fund. That did save funding in 24 because we also, and this was based off of a fund allocation that we had constructed in prior versions for budgeting, where we had a recreation fund, and then we had like a St. Anthony's fund, and we had some of these other bucketed funds that were originally provided money from, I think it was the proceeds of the sewer sale, just to prop up those funds. So it's not like we were replenishing those funding levels in those accounts, but they were ultimately going to be going down to service those functions. But it was one where the best way to kind of track funding levels is really a disparity between general fund and capital fund to make it more transparent in terms of where the money is actually going from A to B. Because if you think about it, that's still public taxpayer type dollar funding that's going towards those initiatives. That makes it cleaner to put it in the general fund. So we had to, this isn't to say that there was a cost increase, it was just a cost relocation, if you will, to put that in the general fund. And then we took a percentage of that and put that into the open space fund because we were allowed to do so. We did some other net reductions in terms of just, we apportioned out more expenditures to, excuse me, not expenditures. We apportioned out more revenue that we do to do administrative support for services towards our regional partners because we do provide financials for the airport. We actually charge the airport money to support them financially. Same thing with the Southern Chester County Regional Police. Some other versions was just essentially going through and looking at underutilized line items within the budget, and then we just collapsed those line items. Some of them were reconsolidation efforts, but I think in the net, we had over $200,000 in the FY24 plan. That was a cost reduction. And that was, of course, also to help support the required increases for services to support that land development department function that we didn't have. And that's a big thing to impart overnight to do it, but we had to do it because we were missing so many pieces of compliance thing.
Moving on to initiatives to improve the finances. You spent some time talking about the White Clay Creek revitalization and activating all of those plans. There was a projected impact of, I think it was high 600s, almost 700,000 revenue impact for the township. What about costs associated with a program like that? You talk about the need for transportation, sewer, stormwater management. Has that been looked at as well?
When you're talking about cost for the township for that, because there's an initial capital cost that's really imparted upon the developer to do just to develop the area. And that's kind of that one-time cost where they are funded. That's not at the cost of the township to do that. That's incurred cost by the developer to get essentially the development made. Now there is that transfer, and that's subject to, I guess, provisions of whether or not the township chooses to adopt infrastructure or not adopt infrastructure. You can make those covenants around kind of like an HOA type model where you're not absorbing that increased infrastructure as well. So that's one component of it. So you would have to deliberately say, thank you for building out White Clay Point. You're going to have to set up an HOA or community type of function, and you're on the hook for supporting your own stormwater maintenance, supporting your own road kind of improvements or transportation improvements. And, you know, that's really just a township decision. That's been, I'll call it mixed in terms of previous historic developments where we chose to adopt and chose not to adopt. So we have versions of both right now.
Right.
It's just whatever moment in time that development gets done, the sentiment of the board at the time to provide those finalizations for adoption of infrastructure.
And when you describe White Clay Creek as having poor transportation, sewer, and stormwater, and that having a significant impact on the desirability of that site for developers, as we go through this rezoning initiative, will we include as part of that mapping and analysis a review of the areas that have combinations of either good transposed sewer and stormwater and bad to help guide our zoning decisions to encourage development where it's likely to be attractive?
That came up in one of the zoning conversations as well with Michael Baker. So they're going to look at just existing infrastructure and kind of where that is, because it doesn't make sense to have like an active land development use in like Lower Landenberg. It's not going to get that infrastructure. But it is one to understand that what are the complexities of issues surrounding, let's call, transportation improvements. So if we do the business park up there by Route 1 and they're doing an interchange improvement PennDOT wise for that interchange, I think they proposed a roundabout solution for that interchange. And then further down the road, they are going to do the intersection, which is going to be essentially like a widening and increase in capacity, but just around the intersection. But that's great. But now you have two end nodes of improvements, but it's still kind of like a very narrow 2-lane road, state road that is, through that remaining part of that. So anybody who comes in there is going to have to think about widening. They're going to have to do it in a manner that can absorb that capacity. That's a transportation cost impediment to getting anybody to commission a development of any sort of the properties up in that area, because they're having to do that. It's not already there. It's not like you're a commercial entity moving next to a highway. You have to move next to the highway and then improve the highway in of itself. And that just differentiates from other types of development opportunities that are out there that don't have to deal with that. So I don't know what those specific costs are, but at least like you're saying, we can allude to where it's, I don't know, they call it like a matrix of it. Like, is it good, bad,
Yeah, heat map
neutral,
or
something like that? That might be helpful.
Thank you. You talked a
Hey,
little bit about
Chris,
stormwater projects, new stormwater projects, and I wonder if you've taken a look at the cost benefit analysis of a new stormwater capital project, or the cost of taking care of deferred maintenance on existing stormwater infrastructure that we have in the township,
Yep.
much of which is in need of repair.
Yeah. I want to say that so right now that is dependent upon even having that inventory completed in the first place. So until we have that, which it's kind of one of the ones where it's like ignorance is bliss. If you currently operate as is and you're just assessing, so the current stormwater projects we have highlighted are because there's been an active issue with those areas. It's either backed up, it's pooling, it's flooding, it's impending a possible collapse. That's what's commissioning those projects. So the stormwater asset inventory plan, what you want to call it, master plan, whatever it is, that's Pannoni going out and looking at where there isn't necessarily highlighted issues. It's kind of like if you do an infrastructure assessment on, like, I think they did it on like the the railway lines on the Mid-Atlantic corridor, and they assessed like, I don't know how many different trestles and bridges that were graded as like a poor F failing kind of thing. It's like, until you look at it, you're really not going to know how bad it actually is. So until we get that done, we really truly won't know what is the best course of action in terms of deferring versus commissioning certain levels of projects. It's really going to depend, because you might have a poorly graded project that is scored poorly, but it's not, it doesn't look like it's going to be failing anytime soon, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't be addressing it. That's kind of a thing, because you never know. And stormwater is one where you almost never know, because you never know how a storm and all of the variables that it represents is just going to impact that one weak point. But the identification of the weak points is the biggest issue.
Last two questions are related to policing costs. And it looked like the policing costs were driven primarily due to collective bargaining agreements. And I didn't see anything related to call volume trends. I think I heard you mention call volumes. And if our population has been going down since the 2010 census, have our policing calls been going down, or them going up, and what relationship between the calls and our growing cost of policing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and to be honest, I would have to get those annual call volumes kind of portioned out, because it depends on the type of call too.
Right.
So you have your severe crimes, your kind of, based off of the last 2 years, everything kind of stays at a flat kind of number, but then I would have to take that same information, because that's just today, and look at like 2010 and then look at 2000. I don't know how back the reporting goes to provide that level of granularity of detail to show.
But does it seem flat?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
I couldn't answer that question right now. I'd have to do that analysis and provide that. And we can actually make that request in the October budget session. I think the early October one, police and fire come, those are the chiefs from each organization, come and talk about it. We'll make sure that that's included in terms of understanding to it, because they're the best resources to get in terms of calls dictating service levels. And I don't want to speak on their behalf. I'm just showing the summary level of costs in terms of the impact of the township.
Right.
Because they
I was
also,
surprised to see the significance of that cost line item compared to the surrounding blue municipalities that
well, that's
don't
the
have
different. I mean, I can go back to it. I have to click back through all the different
Yeah.
components of it. I just put way too many animations in there. Sorry about that. But it's just localities that just chose that state police was going to be their model, and that's a $0 cost
right.
for state police.
Is,
Granted,
is there
Their
crime
service
rates
response
or
times
their?
are significantly longer though. and
Okay,
That's
so
what
they're,
people need to understand. You're paying for premium service to show up within an expert like time frame. So normally it's like 30 to 60 seconds for a response. And that's based off of anywhere our patrol officers are within the region, that they could be there based off of a 911 dispatch transfer that goes to their specific, their radio, and they're inbound. That's what a premium policing service provides. It's an insurance policy in the worst case situation.
Yep.
The issue with state police is that's not the case. So people are inherently accepting a higher level of risk of response that isn't there for state police because they're just more flushed out in terms of a broader coverage area. Their concentration is primarily, like their number one mission is highway patrol. That's what they're there for. They're not community policing oriented organization. They have a different structure. It's everything. So for a community oriented policing department, you have what that type of service represents, which is all aspects of policing, as well as the type of patrol footprint on there as well, because it's kind of a sense of, and this goes back to like my public policy kind of 101 type stuff. The three elements, the three-legged stool, you will, of a model of successful, we'll call them like communities, is you need to have safety, you need to have schools, like good schools, and you need to have a sense of opportunity in the area, economic viability to it. If you have those three things, even if sometimes you don't have all of them at their full capacity, you're gonna have a viable community, if you will. If you start waning away at certain portions of that one and you don't have really strong ones on the other side, you start lessening that viability as well. And that's happening for more rural localities that just don't have the funding requirements out there to support all three. And you can kind of say it as more of a haves and have-nots between rural and non-rural or urban. But that's not to say that where we are as a township and where we are doesn't justify those services, because we're kind of a blended of everything, if that makes sense.
thank you.
Yep.
Right. Anyone else have any questions?
Good. All right.
Hey, Chris, can you hear
Remember,
me?
that's,
It's Christy.
To say that the budget workshop number 2 is going to be for capital. We already alluded it to the proposed plan there. I think there's some final fine tuning. That's going to be on Monday, September 9th, also at 7. It's just going to be a review of the capital plan updates. And then the next budget workshop after that is going to be about mostly general fund, departmental general fund expenditures and revenues. And that's going to be, I think, in the beginning of October. And that's just because I have an out-of-town commitment for my profession here, trades. So I'll be out of the area for the end of September and the board meeting right before that. So it's just the next available time frame to do in October. So without that, I have no more other questions.
No? All right, thank you.
I just want to add, if you go to SCCRPD and type in annual report, you can pull all of those statistics up through the 2023 annual report, and it actually identifies part 1 crimes, part 2 crimes, call for services, DUIs. It'll give you some sense of it, and then you can compare them with the previous annual reports. So you can see the trends.
And of course, this isn't to say that anybody can go to any advertised Public Safety Commission
Right.
meeting, which I think we have a grand total of like 1 really in audience. And that's where, as an entity, the commission goes over all policing aspects too. Those are public meetings. They are located here or in West Grove on the, was it second Thursday of every month?
Yeah, I'll just give you one statistic. So DUIs 2021 was 110. DUIs in 2022 was 108, and DUIs in 2023 was 70. So they've actually trended down, but that's, in my opinion, that's a proactive traffic safety unit. Someone being out there, the word gets out in the community that don't go through New Garden.
So your view is not a reflection of less police.
Correct. I mean, in citations 2023, 1757. Citations in 2022 was 1335. and citations in 2021 was 1635. That's total traffic citations. So it's up, it's down, it's up. But it's something you can spend a little bit of time looking at. It's very interesting. And if you, we also have an interactive crime map, which is part of the, what's it called, Chris?
I think it's a Crime Watch or Crime Stats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a link on here and it actually tell you where part one and part two crimes click on you and give you an idea where they're happening the most. So. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone that came out. Yeah.